I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, tucked deep into the forest at the edge of a small, unmarked road, far from the main highways. I had booked it months in advance, craving the quiet and the chance to be completely alone for a few days. Life had been unbearably loud recently. Work, obligations, the constant buzzing of messages and emails, and I needed silence, a chance to breathe without interruption. I drove up late Friday afternoon, my car loaded with groceries, firewood, and a few basic supplies. The road became narrower as I drove, gravel replacing asphalt, and the trees started closing in on either side, thick and darkening as the sun dipped lower. By the time I found the small wooden sign marking the cabin's entrance, it was nearly twilight. The cabin itself was simple, almost rustic, but solid. Logs stacked tightly, a steep roof, a small porch with a weathered railing, and a chimney that hinted at the wood stove inside. I parked near the door, dragging my bags across the small wooden deck. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, heavy and clean. Inside, it was dim but cozy. The floor was cold wood, but the walls seemed to hold warmth, and a small fireplace sat in the corner, the stonework smooth and practical. There were shelves with a few books and games, a small kitchen area, and a table in the middle of the room. Upstairs, a narrow staircase led to two small bedrooms. I set my things down, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease a little. This was going to be good. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking firewood neatly near the fireplace, checking the pantry, and making sure everything was as it should be. The cabin felt solid, safe, far away from anyone else, and I liked that. I started a fire, listening to the wood crackle and pop as the flames licked the logs, and the darkness outside deepened. I could see the shadows of the trees against the windows, stretching long and still. I made a simple dinner, bread and cheese, some canned soup, and settled in with a book, letting the quiet of the forest sink in. The air was cold but not unbearably so, and the isolation felt therapeutic. Around 9, I went upstairs to the bedroom, planning to sleep early. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I pulled the blankets up around me. I could hear the occasional snap of branches outside, small movements in the underbrush, but it didn't bother me. This was what I wanted, the solitude, the connection to nature without interference. I drifted off quickly. I woke later that night to the sound of something tapping at the window. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just a branch or an animal brushing against the glass. The cabin sat against a slight slope, and I could hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere in the distance, blending with the tapping. I lay still, listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. Sleep returned slowly, but I was aware now of how quiet it was, of how every tiny noise seemed amplified in the darkness. The next morning, I woke to fog rolling through the trees. Everything was damp and muted, and the sunlight barely penetrated the gray mist. I made coffee and breakfast, keeping the fire going, and decided to take a short walk around the property. The forest was dense, and the ground was soft and wet from overnight rain. I noticed the trees were close together, making it easy to lose orientation if I wandered too far. I marked the path mentally as I explored, staying near the cabin. I found a small creek, clear and icy cold, with stones slick and slippery. The sounds of the water moving over rocks were soothing, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the damp earth near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were mine from earlier, but these were different, larger, and the stride uneven. I scanned the edge of the forest but saw nothing. My pulse quickened. The footprints didn't appear aggressive, just deliberate, as if someone had been watching the cabin. I convinced myself it was a hiker or a hunter passing through, but I made a mental note to be cautious. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, tucked deep into the forest at the edge of a small, unmarked road, far from the main highways. I had booked it months in advance, craving the quiet and the chance to be completely alone for a few days. Life had been unbearably loud recently. Work, obligations, the constant buzzing of messages and emails, and I needed silence, a chance to breathe without interruption. I drove up late Friday afternoon, my car loaded with groceries, firewood, and a few basic supplies. The road became narrower as I drove, gravel replacing asphalt, and the trees started closing in on either side, thick and darkening as the sun dipped lower. By the time I found the small wooden sign marking the cabin's entrance, it was nearly twilight. The cabin itself was simple, almost rustic, but solid. Logs stacked tightly, a steep roof, a small porch with a weathered railing, and a chimney that hinted at the wood stove inside. I parked near the door, dragging my bags across the small wooden deck. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, heavy and clean. Inside, it was dim but cozy. The floor was cold wood, but the walls seemed to hold warmth, and a small fireplace sat in the corner, the stonework smooth and practical. There were shelves with a few books and games, a small kitchen area, and a table in the middle of the room. Upstairs, a narrow staircase led to 2 small bedrooms. I set my things down, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease a little. This was going to be good. I spent the first hour unpacking, stacking firewood neatly near the fireplace, checking the pantry, and making sure everything was as it should be. The cabin felt solid, safe, far away from anyone else, and I liked that. I started a fire, listening to the wood crackle and pop as the flames licked the logs, and the darkness outside deepened. I could see the shadows of the trees against the windows, stretching long and still. I made a simple dinner, bread and cheese, some canned soup, and settled in with a book, letting the quiet of the forest sink in. The air was cold but not unbearably so, and the isolation felt therapeutic. Around 9, I went upstairs to the bedroom, planning to sleep early. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I pulled the blankets up around me. I could hear the occasional snap of branches outside, small movements in the underbrush, but it didn't bother me. This was what I wanted, the solitude, the connection to nature without interference. I drifted off quickly. I woke later that night to the sound of something tapping at the window. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just a branch or an animal brushing against the glass. The cabin sat against a slight slope, and I could hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere in the distance, blending with the tapping. I lay still, listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. Sleep returned slowly, but I was aware now of how quiet it was, of how every tiny noise seemed amplified in the darkness. The next morning, I woke to fog rolling through the trees. Everything was damp and muted, and the sunlight barely penetrated the gray mist. I made coffee and breakfast, keeping the fire going, and decided to take a short walk around the property. The forest was dense, and the ground was soft and wet from overnight rain. I noticed the trees were close together, making it easy to lose orientation if I wandered too far. I marked the path mentally as I explored, staying near the cabin. I found a small creek, clear and icy cold, with stones slick and slippery. The sounds of the water moving over rocks were soothing, and for a moment, I felt completely at peace. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something strange, a set of footprints in the damp earth near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were mine from earlier, but these were different, larger, and the stride uneven. I scanned the edge of the forest but saw nothing. My pulse quickened. The footprints didn't appear aggressive, just deliberate, as if someone had been watching the cabin. I convinced myself it was a hiker or a hunter passing through, but I made a mental note to be cautious. The day passed quietly, though I kept checking the windows and doors. I prepared a larger fire for the evening and cooked more food than I needed. As night fell again, I made sure the doors were locked and the windows shut tightly. I sat close to the fire, listening to the wind through the trees, aware now of every noise. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft crunch outside, like someone walking carefully across the gravel. I froze, straining to listen. Then the sound stopped. My heart raced, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a deer or an animal moving near the edge of the forest. I slept in short bursts that night, waking at every small sound. When dawn came, I felt exhausted and tense. I made coffee and sat on the porch, staring into the forest. It was then that I realized the footprints had returned, closer this time, coming right up to the cabin. I could see them in the soft earth near the porch. Someone had been outside in the night. The fear I had felt the night before returned in full force. My mind raced. Should I leave immediately? Should I call for help? But I had no signal on my phone. The area was too remote. The nearest town was at least an hour away. I decided to stay calm, to prepare in case the intruder returned. I spent the day barricading as best I could with furniture, placing heavy objects near the doors, and keeping a sharp metal rod nearby. I checked the windows repeatedly. The forest seemed quiet, but I knew it was deceptive. By nightfall, I was on edge, listening to every rustle, every distant crack. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again, slow footsteps circling the cabin. I couldn't see anyone through the thick fog and shadows. My pulse thumped painfully in my chest. I gripped the metal rod and stayed low near the fire, ready to defend myself if necessary. Hours passed like this, with moments of near panic whenever I heard the slightest sound. I realized that the intruder was no ghost, no supernatural being, but someone who might have been watching for hours, studying the cabin, studying me. The thought made me feel exposed, vulnerable, trapped in this small wooden box surrounded by dense forest. By the third night, exhaustion had set in. I stayed in the bedroom, near the locked door, listening. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. There was silence, heavy and expectant. I strained to hear, barely breathing. After what felt like hours, I caught a faint scraping sound near the back door. Without thinking, I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam landed on a figure crouched low, trying to pry open the door. I screamed silently, adrenaline surging. The figure froze, then darted into the trees. I ran to the door, but they were gone. First light, I didn't wait. I packed quickly, gathering my supplies and checking that everything I needed was ready. I drove down the gravel road, constantly checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following me. By the time I reached the main highway, the fear and tension had left me shaken but relieved. I called the local authorities, reporting the incident. They came the next day to check the cabin. They found signs of forced entry attempts, footprints circling the property, and evidence someone had been there multiple times. They confirmed that it wasn't uncommon in that area for abandoned or isolated cabins to be targeted by people looking to steal or squat. In the weeks afterward, I avoided cabins entirely. But the experience had taught me something crucial. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it can also be unpredictable, and isolation comes with real dangers. I didn't dwell on fear, but I stayed vigilant, aware that even the quietest places could hide threats. The experience, while terrifying, left me stronger, sharper, and much more cautious. I learned to respect both the isolation I sought and the unpredictability of those who might take advantage of it. It started as a simple plan. I wanted a weekend away from the city, away from work, away from people, away from everything that had been eating at me for months. I found a small cabin listed online, far into the forest, near a lake that was supposed to be quiet and isolated. The pictures showed a rough wooden structure with a small porch, a fireplace, and a stack of firewood outside. The trees around it were thick, and in the pictures, it looked like a place where I could finally breathe, where the noise of life wouldn't reach me. I booked it, packed my bag carefully with food, water, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and my camera. I drove for hours, the city slowly disappearing behind me, the roads becoming narrower and more overgrown with weeds at the edges. I was careful to note the directions the host sent me. GPS barely worked after a certain point, and I had to rely on a series of dirt roads, some of which were little more than tire tracks through the woods. I arrived late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the trees, and the forest around the cabin felt quiet in a way that made me tense. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, where the sound of your own movement feels loud and exposed. The cabin itself was even smaller than the photos suggested, but sturdy. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and the smell of old wood mixed with damp pine filled my nose. I dropped my bag and went inside, noting the tiny kitchen, a living area with a sofa and a small table, and a wood stove. The bedroom was small but clean. I lit a few candles to ward off the early darkness, unpacked my food, and stacked the firewood in the corner of the living room, ready for the evening. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and then sat near the flames, reading a book I'd brought. Outside, I could hear the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional bird calling, and the distant creak of trees as the wind moved through them. Everything felt normal, even comforting. I went to bed early, sleeping on a thin mattress that wasn't the most comfortable but was enough. The forest was alive with sound, but nothing alarming, and I fell asleep without incident. I woke before dawn, hearing a soft tapping at the window. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky was clear. I stayed still, listening. The sound came again, light and quick, like small claws or sticks. I pressed my face to the glass but saw nothing in the dim light. I shrugged it off. Animals brushed against the cabin all the time. I wasn't scared, not yet. The first morning passed slowly. I made coffee, watched the sun rise over the lake, and explored the immediate area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees thick with moss, the undergrowth tangled in places. I stuck to a path that ran near the lake. I noted the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft earth and the occasional mark of something larger. Maybe a bear, maybe a big dog. Nothing else. Everything seemed natural. But by the second night, I started to feel the isolation in a way I hadn't anticipated. The quiet was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. Every small sound became magnified. A branch snapping under an animal's foot, leaves rustling without wind, the soft thump of something moving in the dark just outside the cabin. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. The feeling wasn't immediate, not during the day, but as the sun sank behind the trees and the shadows stretched long, it became undeniable. My first instinct was to check the windows and doors. All were locked. I walked around the cabin, shining my flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing. The shadows were thick, and the trees obscured anything moving in the distance. Still, every creak of the floorboards, every brush of wind, felt deliberate. I was alone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, waiting. The second day, I tried to keep busy. I took a long walk around the lake, photographing the reflections on the water, the textures of bark, the way sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered beams. I tried to convince myself I was just anxious, that it was the isolation, that the mind plays tricks when left alone. But as evening came again, the feeling of being watched returned. I was certain now that it wasn't animals. There was an intelligence in the movement, a pattern. Small things would shift in the darkness, just out of reach of my flashlight, too quick for me to see clearly. The hair on my arms stood on end. I spent hours pacing the cabin that night, keeping the fire alive. I made sure my phone was charged, though I had no signal. I checked my camera, hoping maybe I had captured movement outside, but the pictures were empty, showing only dark trees and shadows. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows, and the soft taps at the window began again. I pressed my back to the wall, eyes darting toward every dark corner. Sleep didn't come. By the third day, I decided to investigate. I packed a small bag with essentials. My camera, a flashlight, a knife, a bottle of water. I needed to see if there was anyone out there. I moved quietly, stepping carefully through the brush, listening to the forest. For hours, I saw nothing. No footprints, no signs of human presence. Just my own tracks and the tracks of animals. The air was cool and damp, the smell of earth and decay heavy in my nose. And yet, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being followed. Every time I paused, I heard the soft, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves behind me. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but nothing. Just trees, just shadows. My heart raced, my breathing quickened. I knew now I couldn't rely on logic alone. The fear had grown beyond rational explanation. Night came again, darker than before. I stayed near the cabin, keeping the fire roaring, barricading the doors with a chair and stacked wood. Every noise felt amplified, every rustle a threat. Couldn't eat, barely drank water, barely slept. The isolation had transformed into paranoia. I couldn't tell what was real and what my mind was creating. I considered leaving, but I didn't know which path would be safe in the dark. The nearest road was a mile away, through dense forest, and I had no idea what waited in the shadows. On the fourth day, I resolved to leave at first light. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quietly, checking every corner of the cabin, making sure nothing had moved. When morning came, I stepped outside, the sun breaking over the horizon, golden and reassuring. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The forest was alive, but now it felt like it belonged to the day. I walked toward the path that led to the road, cautious but determined. I kept my knife at my side, my flashlight ready. My steps were careful, measured, but as I moved, I began to notice something. Tracks, footprints, not mine, leading through the woods parallel to mine, always just behind. I froze. I stared, heart hammering. Someone had been there, watching me, following me, waiting for me to leave. Panic surged. I ran, stumbling over roots, pushing through branches, my breath ragged. The path seemed endless. The tracks followed me, parallel, never intersecting, always just far enough to remind me of someone else's presence. I kept running, fueled by fear and adrenaline, until the trees began to thin. I saw the road in the distance, the dirt pale and wide in the morning sun. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning, my lungs on fire, and then I saw a car parked at the edge of the road, an old sedan, its paint faded and dull. I didn't stop. I ran past it and flagged down the first vehicle I saw, a truck coming along the road. I didn't speak. I just got in, hands shaking, clothes torn, breathing hard. The driver didn't ask questions. He could see it in my eyes. I gave him the cabin's location and he said he knew the place. Abandoned, rarely rented, not far from the main road, but dangerous if you were alone. I felt a shiver of relief as he drove me toward town, the forest disappearing behind us. Once back in town, I contacted the authorities. I gave them the location, described the tracks, the signs of someone following me. They investigated, combed the area, and found evidence of a small encampment in the woods near the cabin. A fire pit, remnants of food, worn paths through the underbrush. No one was there when they arrived. They said it was likely a transient, someone living off the grid, possibly watching the cabin for weeks, maybe even months. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was real, and it had been close. Too close. I never returned to the cabin. I sold the photos I had taken, carefully cropping out any signs of the camp or tracks. The memory lingered, a mixture of fear and relief. I realized I had survived because I stayed calm, because I observed, because I never let curiosity outweigh caution. The forest had been quiet, but it had been watching me. The isolation had been real, but not empty. There had been someone else there. I had been lucky, and sometimes I still wake up at night and hear a faint tapping, and I remember the feeling of being followed through the shadows, alone, and how fragile safety can be when the world is silent and the trees are watching. I had been planning the trip for weeks, maybe even months, without really thinking about the isolation or how unprepared I was for the reality of being completely alone in the wilderness. The cabin was in a remote part of the forest, far from any main road, hidden among tall, thick pines and maples. It was advertised online as perfect for solitude and nature lovers, but the reviews were vague, mostly praising the quiet and scenery. I didn't realize how much quiet could actually feel like something pressing down on you until I arrived. I drove the last few miles on a narrow dirt track that wound between dense trees. By the time I parked near the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already low, spilling a dull orange glow across the forest floor. The air was crisp, slightly damp, carrying the smell of pine needles and wet earth. The cabin itself was modest. A single-story wooden structure, faded brown, with a small porch and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. It looked deserted, not in a creepy way at first, just completely alone. I grabbed my backpack and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood, damp air, and the remnants of whatever previous occupants had left behind. Dust motes floated in the weak shafts of light from the windows. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. I set my things down and started exploring the cabin to get a sense of the place. The cupboards were mostly empty except for some old, dry-canned goods. There was a small pile of firewood stacked in the corner. I made a mental note that I would need to light the stove later, not just to cook, but to have some warmth once night fell. The first few hours were easy to fill. I unpacked, collected firewood, and explored the clearing around the cabin. The forest pressed in from all sides, dense and shadowed. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the low murmur of some distant stream. Everything was quiet, but not silent. There was life in the forest, but it wasn't the kind of life that made you feel safe. More like life that existed without caring about me at all. As the sun set and the forest grew darker, I lit the stove and boiled water for some instant soup. The warmth was comforting at first, but once I sat down with my meal, I realized how alone I truly was. The silence was heavier than it had been during the day, almost a physical weight. Every small sound, the crack of a twig outside, the creak of the cabin settling, the low whistle of wind through the trees, felt amplified. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there, even though I knew the cabin was supposed to be isolated. Night fell completely, and with it came a new level of unease. The forest around me became a living, breathing thing. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Every sound seemed to have a source just beyond the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the weak light from the cabin. I had thought I liked solitude. I had been wrong. I tried to sleep, but the bed was thin, the cabin cold, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept hearing noises outside, subtle at first. A branch snapping, something scraping against the cabin walls. I told myself it was just animals. Raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But as the hours dragged on, the noises grew louder and more deliberate. I started imagining someone moving outside, circling the cabin, and the thought made my stomach churn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. There was a pause, then the sound again, closer this time. My heart raced. It wasn't loud enough to be a person walking around with shoes, more like someone or something dragging something along the side of the cabin. I grabbed the small camping knife I had brought and crept to the window, pulling aside the curtain just enough to peek out. The darkness was total beyond the weak glow of the cabin. I could see shapes moving in the shadows between the trees, too large to be ordinary forest animals. I thought about my options. The cabin was my only shelter. I had no cell service, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. If someone had been following me or knew I was here, I was trapped. My mind raced through all the scenarios, most ended badly. I tried to calm myself by thinking logically. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe a large animal had wandered too close. But the movement felt too controlled, too aware, for it to be random. Hours passed like this. Every few minutes, there was another sound. Branches scraping, a thump against the wall, heavy footsteps crunching through leaves. I didn't sleep, and every second I was awake, my imagination painted pictures of someone crouched just outside, watching, waiting. I stayed crouched near the window until dawn, the knife in my hand, barely daring to breathe. When the first light of morning finally broke through the trees, I forced myself outside. Everything looked normal, the way it always did in daylight. The clearing empty, the forest still and quiet. No sign of footprints or broken branches that could suggest someone had been there. I searched carefully, circling the cabin, checking under the porch, scanning the edges of the woods. Nothing. My fear hadn't eased. If anything, it had grown, because what I had heard in the night had to have a cause, and I could see no evidence. That morning, I decided I would leave. I packed quickly, but even then, As I carried my backpack to the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder into the forest, feeling eyes on me. The road back to civilization was long, winding, and completely isolated. I drove slowly, aware that I could be followed at any moment. Every noise from the trees or the brush along the roadside made me tense. By mid-afternoon, I reached the first small town. I stopped at a gas station, finally able to relax just slightly as other people went about their business, unaware of the night I had survived. I bought water and some food, then called the local sheriff to report what had happened. They were polite but skeptical. The area was remote, and there were occasional reports of hikers or campers hearing noises at night, seeing movement that turned out to be wildlife. They advised me to be cautious and perhaps avoid that particular section of forest until someone had checked it. Even after returning home, the memory of that night stayed with me. I replayed every sound, every shadow, every moment of fear in the cabin. I checked my security camera footage once I installed it at my apartment, just to reassure myself that someone couldn't have followed me from town. Nothing. The rational side of me told me it was probably a large animal or even my imagination, fueled by isolation and exhaustion. But the irrational part couldn't stop thinking about what it would have been like if it had been a person, if I had been completely alone and vulnerable. Weeks later, I decided to go back, not to stay, but to check the cabin during daylight. The forest was the same as before, quiet, still, and beautiful in a harsh, raw way. I examined the cabin more thoroughly this time and found subtle signs that confirmed my fears were not entirely imagined. Near the side wall where I had heard the thumps, there were deep scratches in the wood, too high for a deer, too deliberate for a bear. There were marks suggesting someone had tried to peek inside the windows. It wasn't proof that someone had been there that night, but it was evidence that the cabin had been approached by a human before. I had learned something important through that experience. Solitude in nature can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous in ways that aren't immediately obvious. You are completely exposed, relying on nothing but your own judgment and preparedness. The forest is indifferent to humans. It doesn't care if you're afraid or alone. But there are people in the world who do, and in remote places like that, their presence can be threatening. I never stayed in that cabin again. I told myself I would stick to campgrounds or trails where other people were nearby. I also realized the importance of being prepared, knowing escape routes, carrying communication devices, and not underestimating the risks of isolation. It changed the way I approached every trip after that. The scariest part wasn't the night itself. It was the realization that no one knew I was there, that no one would have come to help if things had gone wrong, and that in the silence and darkness you have only yourself to rely on. By acknowledging that vulnerability and learning from it, I survived, and I walked away with a clarity about danger, preparedness, and the unpredictability of being alone in the wild that I would never forget. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The plan was simple: rent a small cabin in the mountains for a week, get away from the city, hike, fish, read, and just breathe for a while. Life in the city had been relentless, work stretching endlessly, emails and notifications never stopping, and the feeling that no matter what I did, I was always behind. The cabin I rented was in a remote area, the kind of place that appeared in travel magazines. Dense forest all around, a small river winding through the property, and trails leading off into the hills. The pictures online were charming, rustic but well-kept, with a wood-burning stove and a porch overlooking the trees. I convinced myself this would be the perfect escape, a chance to disconnect completely. I drove out on a Thursday morning, leaving the city just as the traffic started to build for the weekend. The journey took longer than expected because the roads became narrower and rougher, paved roads giving way to gravel, then dirt, then uneven tracks that shook the car with every pothole. My anxiety about being late started to build as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The map I had printed from the rental site showed a small loop through the forest, but the GPS kept struggling to find a signal. It was one of those moments where the convenience of technology deserts you at exactly the wrong time. At first, it was just annoying, the kind of inconvenience that feels like part of an adventure. But as the road twisted more sharply and the shadows of the trees grew longer, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. When I finally spotted the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat at the end of a narrow clearing, surrounded by tall pines. The windows reflected the late afternoon light, and the wooden siding had started to darken from the rain and wind over the years. There was a single chimney, with faint smoke curling from it, which made me wonder if someone else was there. But as I got closer, I saw that it was just a streak of moss or discoloration. No smoke, no other cars, no signs of recent activity. The silence was heavy. Even the wind seemed muffled. I parked and stepped out, the gravel crunching sharply under my boots. The smell of pine and wet earth was strong, mixed with the faint, almost metallic scent of the river nearby. The cabin door was old but solid. I used the key I had been sent and pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty, a mix of damp wood and something faintly sour, probably from being closed up for a while. Dust motes floated in the last rays of sunlight that sneaked through the curtains. The furniture was basic. A wooden table with a few chairs, a small couch that looked worn, and the wood-burning stove that promised heat once I got it going. I placed my backpack down and walked slowly through each room, taking in the quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. Felt empty but not abandoned. The windows were all intact, the locks functional, and the cupboards had basic supplies. A few cans, a box of matches, and some firewood stacked neatly by the stove. I decided to unpack a little and get a fire going before it got too dark. The evening air was cold, sharper than I expected, so lighting the stove felt like the right first step. I stacked some wood, struck a match, and watched the flames slowly catch, the heat spreading through the room. It was comforting, that primitive sense of warmth against the creeping chill. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and the river nearby made a steady, low gurgle that felt almost hypnotic. As night fell, I realized how completely isolated I was. There were no distant lights, no sounds of cars or towns, just the trees and the river. I thought about walking around the property, maybe following the trail to the riverbank, but the fading light made me hesitate. I told myself I would do it in the morning. Night in the forest is a different world. The shadows are deeper, the sounds sharper. Every rustle in the underbrush feels closer than it actually is. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. I went to bed early, the cabin quiet except for the soft groan of the wood as it settled, and the distant call of an owl somewhere in the forest. I woke in the middle of the night, not to a noise, but to a feeling. A deep sense of unease that I could not shake. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was dimly lit by moonlight filtering through the curtains. I lay there, listening, straining for any sound beyond the occasional sigh of wind. Then I heard it, the distinct crack of a branch breaking, not far from the cabin. My heart jumped. It could have been anything, a deer, a falling branch, but it sounded deliberate in a way that unsettled me. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check the area. I walked slowly around the cabin, taking note of the terrain. The forest was dense but navigable, and the riverbank was steep in places but reachable. As I moved, I saw footprints in the damp soil near the back of the cabin. They were not mine. They were boot prints, large, heavy. I froze, looking around. The prints led from the tree line directly to the back of the cabin, then stopped. No one was visible. I told myself it could be an old hunter, someone who had passed by in the last few days. Still, the feeling of being watched started to creep in. I tried to shake it off and focused on hiking. The trails were narrow and winding, sometimes ending abruptly at a dense wall of trees or steep drop-offs. I spent hours walking, taking care not to disturb the fragile balance of the forest. When I returned, I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, preparing food, checking the cabin for anything out of place. Each time I looked outside, I felt the same sensation, like someone was observing me from the shadows. I avoided the back of the cabin as much as possible. The third day, I went further into the woods, following a small stream that branched off from the main river. The trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker. I lost track of time, and by the time I decided to head back, the sun had dipped low. I realized then that I had strayed further from the cabin than I had intended. The trail markers were faint, the undergrowth thicker, and the light dim. Panic started to set in as I tried to retrace my steps. Every turn looked the same, every tree seemed identical. I felt the weight of solitude press down on me, the kind of fear that is not sudden but slowly creeping, growing heavier with each misstep. Hours passed. I tried to remain calm, using the stream as a guide, knowing it would eventually lead me back toward the river near the cabin. The forest grew darker, the shadows merging into one another. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my hands and legs scratched and bleeding in places, my clothes damp from the wet brush. I thought about the cabin, the safety it represented, and pushed myself harder. By the time I saw the faint glow of the stove fire through the trees, relief washed over me. I ran the last few yards, tripping over a root and landing hard, but the cabin was there, solid, real, safe. Inside, I tended to my scratches, cleaned up, and made sure the fire was solid. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rattling the windows, the trees creaking, the river churning. I stayed awake, listening, until dawn, the fear gnawing at me. The following day, I decided to take precautions. I cleared a small perimeter around the cabin, making noise and marking the area so I could see if anyone approached. I stacked firewood strategically to create noise if moved, and I kept a knife at hand while walking outside. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt oppressive. I realized I could not depend on being alone as a safety measure. The forest did not guarantee safety. It was on the 5th day that I realized the danger was not imaginary. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing outside. It was faint at first, then closer. My stomach dropped. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The door handle rattled. Someone was there. I had been careful not to leave signs, but somehow, someone had found me. I grabbed the only real protection I had, a sturdy hatchet I used for chopping wood, and moved toward the door slowly, making sure I could see without fully revealing myself. When I opened the door, there was no one, but the boot prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the porch. They had circled the cabin, clearly inspecting it. I could feel the presence of someone who had been there while I slept, someone bold enough to come close, yet hidden in the trees. Panic surged, but I knew I had to stay rational. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I reinforced the doors, stacked more wood near the windows, and kept a fire going, knowing it could signal life but also make noise if disturbed. The 6th day was tense, silent, almost unbearable. I stayed inside, only stepping out briefly to check traps I had improvised, or to make noise to see if anyone reacted. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched was constant. I realized then that the forest could hide anyone, and at night, the darkness could hide anyone close enough to strike without warning. By the 7th day, I had a plan. I would leave before sunset, drive back to the nearest town, and avoid the cabin forever. I packed carefully, taking nothing unnecessary, and kept one eye on the perimeter. As I locked the cabin, I noticed fresh footprints again, leading to the tree line, but this time they stopped abruptly. Someone had been there, waiting or watching me leave. I didn't wait to find out. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove slowly at first, then faster as I reached the dirt road. The forest receded behind me, the mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror. My hands shook the entire drive. I stopped a few times just to check the road ahead, hyper-aware of every shadow. By the time I reached a town with lights and people, I felt the tension begin to release, though it lingered like a bad memory. Weeks later, I learned from the cabin rental company that the previous renters had reported similar incidents. Signs of intruders, footprints, items moved. The area was known to locals for being isolated and dangerous, and there had been reports of break-ins, mostly opportunistic thieves or people looking to hide from authorities. It was not supernatural, not fantastic, it was real and it was terrifying. I never returned. I made sure to warn others about the cabin. The experience left me shaken but also more aware of how fragile a sense of security can be, even in a place that seems perfect and peaceful. I learned that isolation is not always freedom, and that sometimes danger comes not from monsters or myths, but from the real world, hidden in plain sight and patient enough to wait. Even now, years later, I can remember the way the wind sounded through the trees, the cold bite of the river air, and the feeling of footsteps outside my window when I was alone. The cabin itself is just wood and stone, but the memory is sharp, a lesson in vigilance and respect for the quiet, for the unknown, and for the simple fact that some places, no matter how beautiful, can hide threats that are entirely human and entirely real. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It wasn't that I disliked people. I just needed time away from everyone. The city, with its noise and endless movement, had worn me down. I had been working 12-hour shifts at a factory for almost a year, living in a cramped apartment with paper-thin walls, and listening to neighbors argue or complain every night. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of quiet where I could hear myself think. That was the reason I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't far from the main road, but it felt like it was a world away. The first day I arrived, the sun was still high, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. The drive had been long, twisting along roads lined with thick trees that blocked the horizon, their trunks casting long shadows that moved as the wind blew. I parked near the cabin and walked the rest of the way. I had chosen this particular place because the pictures showed it as a small wooden structure surrounded by forest, with no neighbors in sight. It had a little porch, a single bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. I carried my backpack, a small cooler of food, a first aid kit, and a lantern in case the power went out. The cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, the kind of smell that comes from being closed up for months. I opened all the windows to let fresh air in and unpacked slowly. I liked doing things carefully even when alone. There was a small woodpile outside the door, and I stacked some logs near the fireplace for later. The sun was setting as I finished, leaving the forest in a mix of orange and purple light. I made a simple dinner, eating slowly, and then cleaned up. Outside, the first insects started their evening chorus, the hum of crickets mixing with the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Night fell quickly in the forest. I lit the fireplace and sat in front of it with a blanket wrapped around me. The fire crackled and smelled faintly of smoke. The darkness outside was complete. I could see only the small circle of light the fire made through the cabin windows. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called, a hollow, eerie sound that echoed. It made my stomach tighten, even though I knew it was nothing dangerous. I went to bed early. The cabin's mattress was firm but not uncomfortable, and the pillow smelled faintly of cedar. I had brought a small battery-powered alarm clock, but I didn't set it. I wanted to wake naturally. The wind had picked up, and I could hear it moving through the trees, making branches scrape against the cabin roof. It was soothing at first, but as the hours passed, the noises grew sharper, closer, as if something was moving just outside. I lay still, listening, telling myself it was only animals. There were deer, raccoons, foxes, sometimes bears in the area. None of it mattered, they were all part of the forest. I woke in the middle of the night to a sudden loud bang. My heart jumped. I sat up and listened. Nothing moved inside the cabin. Then I heard it again, a sharp cracking sound from the back, like a heavy branch falling onto something. I tried to convince myself it was a branch breaking, but the sound had come from very close, too close to be just nature. I got up carefully, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed my small flashlight from the bedside table and shined it toward the back window. The forest outside was a solid black, the firelight long gone, and I couldn't see anything. I walked to the door slowly, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. The wind had died down, and the night was unnaturally quiet. No animals, no rustling leaves, no distant calls. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my thin hoodie. I shined the light around, scanning the area. Nothing, just the trees, the ground, and shadows stretching long in the flashlight beam. I even walked along the perimeter of the cabin, checking the woodpile, the small shed at the back, and the nearby trees. There was no sign of anything unusual. I tried to go back inside and calm myself, but the sound had shaken me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every small noise, the creaking of wood, the tap of a branch against the roof, made my stomach drop. I kept my flashlight close, just in case, and tried to rationalize every sound. It had to be animals. There was no other explanation. The next morning, I found something odd. One of the logs I had stacked neatly outside the back door was lying across the porch, partially covered in leaves and dirt. I remembered stacking them perfectly the night before. I couldn't understand how it had fallen. The wind hadn't been strong enough. Maybe I had stacked it wrong, I told myself, but something about the way it lay there made my skin crawl. I decided to go into town to get supplies. I wanted to check on the cabin in daylight to remind myself it was safe. The store was small, dusty, and quiet. I bought some extra food, batteries, and a larger flashlight. On the way back, the forest seemed alive, watching. The trees cast strange, moving shadows on the road, and I kept my eyes glued to the path ahead. I tried not to think about the night, telling myself it was only my imagination. Back at the cabin, I stacked the logs again and checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, and nothing looked disturbed. I even put a few rocks near the back door, thinking if anyone or anything tried to move in, I would hear it. The rest of the day passed slowly, but uneventfully. I made myself lunch, cleaned the kitchen, and even cut some more firewood. The second night, it happened again. A noise at the back of the cabin, soft at first, like someone walking on dry leaves. I froze, trying to listen. Then the sound got louder, closer. My heart raced, and I grabbed my flashlight and the small hatchet I had brought, gripping it tightly. I walked to the back door, shining the light. A raccoon, I thought at first. But no, the footprints outside were human. Bare footprints pressed into the soft earth, leading up to the back porch. I followed them with the light, trying to see where they went. They disappeared into the forest. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in front of the fire, listening. Every small sound made me tense. The wind, the branches, the distant call of a bird, even the sound of my own breathing. I couldn't get comfortable. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, wanting to go back to the safety of the town, to people and lights. But when I tried to start the car, the battery was dead. I hadn't left any lights on, and the car had been fine the day before. Panic started to rise. I checked the battery and cables, but I didn't know much about cars. My phone had no signal. I was completely alone. I walked back to the cabin to think. That's when I noticed the front door. It had been unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. My stomach turned. I checked the inside. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I stayed inside, pacing, trying to calm myself. I even checked every window and door multiple times. That night, I stayed awake, barely moving, listening. And then I heard it, the soft scraping of something against the cabin walls. Not outside, not a branch, something moving against the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet and slowly opened the door. No one was there, just the wind, I tried to tell myself. I sat back down, sweating and shaking, until the sun started to rise. The next day, I couldn't wait any longer. I walked down the road to find a neighbor. It was a long walk, maybe 3 miles, and my legs ached. But eventually, I found a small house at the edge of the forest. An older man was tending his garden. I explained my situation, though I didn't mention the footprints or the noises, not wanting to sound paranoid. He listened quietly, then offered to give me a jump start for my car. Back at the cabin, I waited with him until he arrived with jumper cables. He hooked the car up, and it started immediately. I felt relief flood through me. I packed my things quickly, barely looking at the cabin as I left. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to close in behind me, dark and silent. I didn't turn back. The whole trip had been supposed to be peaceful, but the feeling of someone or something watching, moving, just out of sight had made it unbearable. I returned home and didn't go back to the woods for years. The cabin rental no longer appealed to me. The memory of those nights, the footprints, the noises, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I realized later that the forest can be quiet in ways that feel almost alive, almost conscious. I didn't see anyone or anything, but the tracks and sounds were proof that I hadn't been completely alone. Eventually, I stopped thinking about it all the time, but sometimes at night, when the wind rattles the windows and a branch scrapes against the side of my apartment building, I remember the cabin. I remember the fear of being truly alone, but watched. And I know that the forest can hide people, or worse, without leaving more than a trace. It's been years now, and I still can't explain the footprints or the sounds. I never told anyone what really happened. People might think I imagined it, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. And sometimes, even in my safe apartment in the city, I check the locks twice, and I make sure no one is lurking just outside, because that fear from the cabin never really leaves. It's not supernatural, it's real. And sometimes reality is scarier than anything else. I remember the drive to the cabin with a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness. The road wound deep into the forest, narrow and uneven, flanked on both sides by tall, dense pine trees whose shadows stretched across the cracked asphalt. The sunlight was fading when I finally reached the last turn, a dirt track that led steeply upward. The car tires crunched over loose gravel, each rock sounding louder than it should. And every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the forest seemed to close in a little more. The sky had already started to darken, turning a dull gray that made the forest feel heavier, almost oppressive. The cabin itself was not impressive from the road. It looked old, a wooden structure with a steep roof and dark, weathered planks. The windows were small, and their glass reflected the forest in a way that made them almost invisible. From a distance, it seemed abandoned, but I knew it wasn't. It had electricity, a small generator for emergencies, and I had brought supplies for a week. The thought of being alone out here both thrilled and unsettled me. I parked the car and stepped out, listening to the silence. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of pine needles and wet soil. It felt alive, almost watching, and I could hear the faint rustle of branches and distant birds settling down for the night. The cabin door was stiff, and it groaned loudly when I opened it. Inside, it smelled of old wood and faint mildew. The furniture was sparse, mostly a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner, and a cast-iron stove that had obviously not been used in a long time. I dropped my backpack and walked around, testing the taps and checking the small bathroom. The water ran, but it smelled faintly metallic, so I decided to rely mostly on bottled water I had brought. As night fell, the forest outside became an inky black. I lit a small lamp and set it on the table. Its warm glow contrasted sharply with the cold, gray shadows that crept along the walls. I made a simple meal, canned beans and some bread, but even while eating, I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a constant whispering that pressed against the walls of the cabin. It was not threatening, exactly, but it was persistent, unsettling in a way I couldn't shake. After eating, I settled by the stove, though I did not light it yet. The darkness outside made me realize how alone I truly was. No neighbors for miles, no cars, no lights, nothing but the forest. My phone barely had signal, and I had brought a small radio, but it barely picked up static. I felt a twinge of fear, irrational at first, but then it started to grow as I considered the possibility of being trapped out here if something went wrong. The thought of injury, or getting lost if I ventured outside at night, made my stomach tighten. I tried to sleep, but the creaks of the cabin were loud, almost exaggerated in the quiet. The floorboards groaned under their own weight, and occasionally, I would hear what sounded like twigs snapping outside. I told myself it was probably deer, maybe a raccoon, but each snap made my heart jump. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, imagining the warm sun on my face and the road home, but every time I drifted, the sounds outside seemed closer. At some point during the night, I woke up to a sound that made me sit bolt upright. It was a series of soft thumps, deliberate and slow, like someone or something was walking very carefully outside. The thumping stopped abruptly, then started again a few minutes later, moving around the cabin. My first instinct was to convince myself it was an animal, but the rhythm was too consistent, too measured for a deer or bear. I could feel my pulse racing. I stayed frozen, listening, straining my eyes in the dark. I didn't have a weapon, not a proper one, just a pocket knife that would barely protect me against anything serious. Then, on the fourth night, something changed. I woke suddenly around 2 in the morning, sweating, my heart pounding. First, I thought it was a dream. Then I heard it. A soft scraping noise outside, coming from the porch. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then came again, slower, deliberate. Someone or something was there. I waited, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or deer, but the sound didn't match any animal I knew. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking. Peering out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The pond reflected the moonlight, but the trees cast long, black shadows that seemed to move even without wind. The scraping came again, closer this time, as if someone was trying to test the cabin. My chest tightened. I considered leaving immediately, but my car was too far, and the forest around the cabin was unfamiliar. I decided to wait, hoping it was a passing animal. Hours passed, and eventually the noises stopped. Sleep didn't come again that night. The next morning I found more signs. Small footprints were scattered around the cabin, circling it. They were definitely human-sized, but I saw no other evidence of who it could be. The realization hit me. Someone was nearby, watching, possibly waiting. I spent the day pacing, checking locks, looking for anything I could use to protect myself. The cabin had only one door, a sturdy wooden slab, and windows I could lock, but it felt vulnerable. Over the next 2 days, the tension escalated. At night, I could hear someone or something moving in the woods, sometimes far, sometimes close. I saw glimpses of movement, shadows flitting between trees, but never anyone fully. During the day, the forest seemed normal, but my mind stayed on edge. I started sleeping in short bursts, flashlight in hand, checking the cabin perimeter repeatedly. I realized I couldn't stay calm. This was not just isolation or imagination. Someone had found me. By the 6th day, I decided I needed to leave, but the car was blocked by fallen branches that hadn't been there before. The path back to the main road was narrow, easy to hide in, and I felt certain someone had been following me when I explored. I packed my things quickly, keeping knives and the first aid kit close. I planned to leave at first light, taking the longest trail that led toward the road. That night was unbearable. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, every shadow sinister. Around midnight, I heard breathing outside, slow and deliberate. My stomach turned to ice. I stayed completely still, gripping the flashlight and a kitchen knife I had taken from the cabin. The breathing stopped. I heard nothing for hours, then a faint whisper of footsteps running off into the forest. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I set out. I walked quickly but quietly, keeping to the thickest parts of the underbrush for cover. I kept looking over my shoulder, hearing distant snaps of branches, but I didn't stop. The trail twisted and turned, but I followed my earlier markings. Hours later, exhausted and bleeding from scratches on my arms and legs, I finally reached a wider path, the remnants of a logging road that connected to the main highway. Relief flooded me. By mid-afternoon, I found a house along the road and ran to it. I pounded on the door, breathless, terrified. The owners were shocked to see me, but they called the authorities immediately. I explained everything, though my voice trembled. The police came quickly, taking notes, searching the area around the cabin. They found no one, no evidence of anyone else living near the cabin. No signs of repeated trespassing besides the prints I had seen. It was unsettling, they couldn't explain it. In the end, I left the forest, never returned to that cabin. I rented a small apartment closer to civilization and tried to return to normal life. Nights were hardest. For months, I woke suddenly, heart pounding, feeling watched, remembering the soft scraping outside, the faint shadows in the forest, the slow breathing outside the cabin walls. I never found out who or what had been there, but I knew it had been real. The experience changed me. I learned to trust instincts, to never underestimate isolation, and to prepare for the unexpected. I returned to nature eventually, but only to populated campsites, only where others were near. The forest had a beauty I loved, but the memory of that cabin, the silence, the footprints, the unrelenting fear, would stay with me forever. It was a reminder that some places, even when they seem safe and quiet, hold dangers beyond imagination. And sometimes the scariest moments are not caused by monsters or ghosts, but by real people, real intentions, and the terrifying reality of being completely alone. I had been planning this trip for months. The city had been draining me. Work, traffic, people everywhere, and the constant noise in my apartment. I just needed to get away, even if it was for a few days. The idea of being completely alone in the woods, far from everything, was intoxicating. I had rented a small cabin through a website I had never used before, just a little wooden cabin nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. When I booked it, the photos looked perfect. A small porch, a fireplace, a few old but comfortable-looking furniture pieces, and a big window that opened onto the forest. I told myself that, if nothing else, the quiet would be worth it. The drive out there was long and mostly uneventful. The roads became narrower as I left the main highway, the trees growing taller and thicker on both sides, until the sunlight barely touched the asphalt. My phone had barely any signal, which I thought was a good thing at first. I liked the idea of being disconnected. I felt a kind of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. I parked the car on a small patch of gravel that served as the cabin's driveway and got out, stretching my legs and letting the silence hit me. It was heavier than I expected. Not peaceful, exactly, but the kind of quiet that made you notice every sound. A branch snapping in the distance, the wind moving through the trees, a bird calling somewhere far off. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. It smelled faintly of old wood and dampness, but not unpleasantly. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The interior was simple. A small kitchen area to the left, a little living space with a couch and a small table, a bedroom in the back with a big, dusty mattress, and the bathroom at the side. The fireplace looked functional but hadn't been used in years. Dust covered the corners and some of the furniture, but it wasn't unbearable. I set my bag down, walked over to the window, and looked out at the forest. The trees swayed slightly, casting long shadows. The sun was beginning to lower, turning everything golden. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, the kind of feeling you get when you are somewhere new and completely isolated. I unpacked slowly, setting a few essentials around the cabin. I had brought a small portable speaker, some food, bottled water, a first aid kit, and extra blankets. I checked the cabin from top to bottom, making sure the windows were locked and nothing looked broken. Everything seemed normal, though I noticed that the door to the cellar in the corner of the kitchen creaked ominously when I opened it. I didn't think much of it. Most old cabins had basements. By the time I had finished, the sun was low, and the forest outside was turning orange and red. I decided to take a walk down the small trail I had noticed on the way in. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile before it ended at a small clearing with a creek. The air smelled earthy, like wet leaves and pine. Everything was quiet except for the occasional sound of running water and the distant rustling of animals in the underbrush. I didn't see anyone. The isolation felt good, like the world had stopped. When I returned to the cabin, the forest had darkened considerably. Shadows stretched long and deep, and the silence was more noticeable than ever. I lit a small lamp I had brought and sat near the fireplace, thinking about dinner. I made some simple pasta, nothing fancy, and ate while glancing out the window. The forest looked black now, but I could still see shapes moving. Small things, probably squirrels or raccoons, I told myself. I had brought a flashlight and a lantern just in case. After eating, I cleaned up and sat in the living room, trying to read, but my mind kept wandering. Every time I heard a branch snap, I turned my head quickly, expecting someone or something to be there. I laughed at myself a few times, trying to calm down. It was just the woods. I was alone. Nothing was out there except animals. That night, I tried to sleep, but it was harder than I expected. The wind was picking up, and I could hear it howling through the trees. Occasionally, I heard a heavier sound, like a branch falling somewhere in the distance. I kept telling myself it was nothing. I had my phone, my supplies, and I was careful to keep the cabin secure. I tried to focus on breathing slowly, closing my eyes, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but not a voice, more like something scraping. I froze, listening. The sound came again, a little louder and closer. It was coming from outside the cabin, near the front porch. I slowly got out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and grabbed my flashlight. My heart was pounding. I shone the light across the yard. Nothing. The trees swayed, shadows moving in the flashlight beam, but nothing else. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining things. Animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer, brushing against the porch. I set the flashlight down and went back to bed, though I slept in short bursts, waking up at every sound. The morning came slowly. I left the curtains open, hoping to let sunlight in to chase away the shadows. Breakfast was a granola bar and coffee, which I sipped nervously. The next day, I decided to explore further. I took my backpack, filled with water, food, and the flashlight, and walked deeper into the forest. The trail became narrower, less maintained, until I was walking over fallen branches and through patches of mud. I realized quickly that I had no idea where I was. The cabin had seemed close when I left, but now every turn looked the same. I tried to mark the path with small sticks, but the forest was dense, and I felt like I was going in circles. Eventually, the sounds faded. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for anything, catching every tiny sound. When the first light of morning crept through the windows, I felt some relief, but the unease didn't go away. During the day, I explored the surroundings cautiously. The cabin was on a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. There were animal tracks in the mud, and I saw distant movements that could have been deer, though I couldn't be certain. The isolation that seemed peaceful in the light of day carried an underlying tension I couldn't shake. I spent the day gathering firewood and reinforcing the cabin door with spare planks I found in a shed beside the cabin. I also tied small bells to the ropes on the windows so that if anyone or anything approached, I would know. It was a small comfort, but it helped calm me. I made a more substantial meal and sat by the lamp, writing notes in my notebook about the forest, the animals I saw, the weather. Keeping busy helped keep the fear at bay, but the thought of nightfall remained heavy on my mind. When darkness returned, the forest seemed louder. The wind moved differently, carrying unfamiliar sounds. I stayed alert, listening to every shift of leaves and every distant crack of a branch. Around midnight, I heard the thumping again. This time it was closer. I grabbed the knife and slowly walked to the window. My heart was hammering, my hands shaking. I could see nothing through the trees, but then I noticed a shadow moving between the trunks. Not an animal, not like the deer I had seen in daylight. This was upright, deliberate. Panic surged. I backed away from the window, thinking about what to do. Calling for help seemed useless. My phone had no signal. The shadow paused, then moved along the edge of the clearing. I realized it was circling the cabin. I remembered the planks I had nailed across the door, the bells I had set. They had started ringing softly as the shadow moved close. I held my breath, hoping it would move on. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The shadow disappeared, but I didn't sleep. I kept the lamp burning all night, my eyes fixed on the windows. By morning, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I knew I couldn't stay another night without risking a breakdown. I packed my things quickly, leaving behind non-essential items, and prepared to leave. I decided to take the longer path out, through the forest, rather than risk encountering the figure on the road. The trek back through the forest was grueling. The mud slowed my pace, and my muscles ached from tension and fear. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and every shadow looked like someone following me. I didn't dare stop for a break until I reached the main road, where I finally saw a car in the distance. Relief washed over me. I ran the last stretch, waving my arms. When the driver stopped, I felt like I might collapse from exhaustion and fear. I explained as best I could, though I didn't go into every detail. By the time I got home, I felt a lingering paranoia. I locked every door and window, triple-checked the perimeter, and didn't leave the house for the next day except for essentials. I reported the incident to local authorities, though they said it might have been a squatter or someone hiding in the woods. They promised to investigate, but nothing was ever found. Months later, I still think about that cabin. The forest no longer feels peaceful to me. I still hear sounds when I'm alone at home, echoes of that night. But I also learned how resilient I could be when faced with real danger. I learned how to plan, how to stay alert, how to survive on my own. That cabin, with its oppressive darkness and unseen presence, changed me in ways I could never have imagined. I don't return to the woods anymore, but I carry the memory, vivid and sharp, as a reminder of how easily isolation can turn terrifying, and how careful you must be when you step into it alone. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. After months of endless noise and stress in the city, I needed isolation, a place far away from people, phones, and responsibilities. I found a small cabin online, tucked deep in the northern forest, miles from the nearest town. The pictures made it look perfect, wooden, weathered but sturdy, with a small porch that overlooked a pond and dense trees surrounding the area. It was exactly what I wanted, the kind of solitude where I could finally breathe and feel like nothing else existed. I left the city early in the morning, packing only essentials. A backpack with food for a week, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a camping stove, some blankets, and my journal. The drive was long, taking me along winding roads that narrowed as I approached the forest. The sun was rising, spilling pale light across the treetops, and for a moment, everything felt calm. Even my anxiety seemed to lift as the road became less traveled, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and the smell of pine filling the air. By mid-afternoon, I reached the small dirt path that led to the cabin. The GPS had stopped working long before this point, and the last few miles were a careful navigation through undergrowth and fallen leaves. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even better than the photos. The wood was rough but solid, the roof intact, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Even though I knew no one was supposed to be there, the pond shimmered in the fading sunlight, reflecting the dense green of the forest around it. I parked my car on a small clearing and stepped out, stretching my stiff muscles. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of cars or people, but a deep, almost heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. There was no wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the pond water lapping against the shore. It felt too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I unloaded my things, bringing the essentials inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and faint dampness. Dust covered the shelves and the corners, but the place was in surprisingly good shape. I set up my small stove in the kitchen, unpacked food, and made a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows in the cabin grew long and strange, twisting across the walls. I lit a few candles to keep the place bright, but even with the small flames, the corners of the room seemed darker than they should be. The first night was the hardest. Alone in a cabin, every small sound seemed amplified. The creak of the wood as it settled, the distant rustle of branches outside, the occasional splash in the pond. It all felt unnervingly close. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was normal. Old cabins made noises, wildlife lived nearby. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined shapes moving outside the window, watching. My heart pounded at every knock or snap of a branch. I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, exhausted and tense. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. The forest around the cabin was dense, thick with undergrowth and tall trees. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, the soil soft beneath my boots and leaves crunching underfoot. Birds occasionally called, and I saw a few squirrels darting through the trees. For the first time since arriving, I felt a little relief. The forest was alive, but it was normal life, not the silence of the cabin that felt almost unnatural. By mid-morning, I returned to the cabin to eat. I noticed something strange. A small footprint in the dirt near the porch. It was fresh, too small to be an animal like a deer, almost human, but I couldn't be sure. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe a hiker had passed by, though it seemed unlikely given the isolation. Still, it made my stomach tighten. Over the next few days, I tried to settle into a routine. I collected water from the pond, cooked simple meals, and spent hours reading or writing in my journal. I explored small sections of the forest each day, careful to mark my path so I could find my way back. I noticed occasional signs of wildlife. Broken branches, claw marks on trees, the distant howl of a wolf, or a deer running through the brush. Each time, I felt a mixture of awe and unease. The forest was beautiful, but it also reminded me how alone I was. After a few hours, I came across an old, abandoned cabin. The wood was rotting, the roof had holes, and the windows were broken. The smell was overwhelming: mold, decay, dampness. I didn't linger long, taking pictures just to remember it, and continued walking. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh footprints in the mud, leading in the same direction I was walking. They were human, about the size of my shoes, maybe slightly larger. I froze, scanning the forest. I could see nothing, but the footprints were unmistakable. I debated turning back, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed them for a short distance, trying to stay quiet, listening for any sounds. The forest grew darker as the afternoon passed, the sun dropping behind the trees. Shadows grew long again, and I realized with a jolt that I had no idea how to get back to the cabin. The trail had disappeared. The footprints had vanished too. Panic began to creep in. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat on my back even though it was cool. I decided to try to retrace my steps. I remembered the abandoned cabin and headed back that way, hoping it would guide me. But the forest had a way of looking the same in every direction. I stumbled over roots, slipped in mud, and my flashlight in my backpack wasn't enough to see well once the sun fully set. Darkness engulfed me, and I realized I was truly alone. By the time I found a spot to rest, it was pitch black. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, branches breaking, and the occasional animal moving nearby. Every sound made me jump. I took out my small portable lantern, setting it on a rock to give myself some light. I ate a little food, drank water, and tried to calm myself. I reminded myself that I knew the general direction of the cabin. I had to stay calm and focus. Panic would only make it worse. I began walking slowly, trying to remember landmarks. Every so often, I stopped, listening. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not distant. Not a small animal, but deliberate, heavy footsteps, moving toward me. I froze. My heart stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear them clearly now. They weren't fast, but steady, deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was moving closer. I gripped my flashlight tightly and shone it in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the forest. I started moving slowly backward, careful not to make noise, hoping whoever it was would leave. But the footsteps continued. My mind raced, imagining break-ins, people lost in the woods, all the terrifying possibilities. Eventually, I ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought they could. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from the sound. My flashlight bounced wildly as I ran, casting strange shadows that seemed to follow me. I fell more than once, scraping my hands and knees on roots and rocks. The footsteps followed. Then I saw it. A faint light through the trees, swinging slightly as if someone were carrying it. Relief washed over me, but so did terror. Whoever it was had a lantern, and they were moving slowly, deliberately. I considered hiding, but my exhaustion and panic made me move toward the light. I called out, and this time the person answered with a flashlight beam swinging toward me. It was another hiker, older man, looking just as surprised as I was. He had been hiking for the day and noticed my flashlight bouncing in the distance. He guided me back through the forest, carefully pointing out landmarks. Hours had passed, and we finally arrived back at my cabin. I was shaking, exhausted, and dirty, but safe. He stayed long enough to make sure I was okay before heading back toward the trail he had come from. The rest of my stay was uneventful, though I spent most of my time inside the cabin, too wary to go far into the forest again. I double-checked all locks, secured my doors, and kept a fire going at night. When it was finally time to leave, I packed up slowly, looking back at the cabin one last time. The forest was beautiful, but it was also dangerous, unpredictable, and isolated. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. The experience had left me exhausted, but I had learned something important. The woods are not friendly, and isolation amplifies every sound, every movement. I never went back to that area, but I carried the memory with me. It was a reminder of how small we are, how easily we can be lost, and how real fear can be without any ghosts or fairy tales. Just the world, raw and untamed, and the knowledge that sometimes the only thing keeping you safe is your own awareness and luck. I had been looking forward to the cabin trip for months. It was the middle of October, and I wanted a weekend away from everything. My job, the city, the constant noise. I found the cabin online, tucked far into a national forest, a little over a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The photos made it look perfect. A rustic wood structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by thick pines and a small creek running nearby. The owner promised it was quiet, remote, and private. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive up was longer than I expected. The road narrowed to a single-lane gravel path winding steeply into the hills, the kind where if a car came the other way, one of us would have to back up. My phone lost service halfway through, but that didn't bother me. I wanted to disconnect. I parked in the small clearing in front of the cabin and stepped out. The air was sharp, filled with the scent of wet leaves and pine. The sky was gray, and the clouds hung low between the trees. I carried my bags inside, noting the quiet around me. There was no sound except the distant trickle of the creek and the wind shaking the trees. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. The living room was small, with a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The furniture was simple: a couch, a chair, and a wooden table with 4 chairs. There was a kitchen with a stove, sink, and a small fridge, all functional. I unpacked my things into the bedroom, a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out into the trees. I ran my hands over the wooden surfaces, feeling the age and solidity of the cabin. It felt sturdy, safe in a way, isolated but reliable. I decided to explore the surrounding area before night fell. The forest was dense, the ground soft with fallen leaves. I followed the creek upstream, stepping carefully over wet rocks, listening to the occasional crack of a branch under my feet. It felt good to be out there, alone with just the trees and the wind. I walked for nearly an hour before I realized how far I had gone. The light was fading fast, and I turned back toward the cabin, but I noticed something odd. There were faint footprints in the mud along the creek, footprints that didn't match mine. They were human and they weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. I felt a chill, but I shrugged it off. People hiked in these woods all the time. Maybe someone else had been here earlier in the day. When I got back to the cabin, I decided to make a fire in the fireplace. I had brought firewood with me, and the smell of burning wood filled the room almost immediately. I sat on the couch, watching the flames, feeling the warmth against the cold creeping in from the windows. The cabin was quiet, peaceful in a way, but there was also a strange tension I couldn't shake. The forest outside seemed darker, more solid, as if it was pressing against the windows. I tried to focus on the fire, on the sound of it crackling. Night fell completely, and I went to bed early. The bed was comfortable, and I slept deeply for a few hours. Then I woke with a start. There was a noise outside, soft, deliberate. At first, I thought it was the wind or an animal, but it wasn't random. It sounded like someone walking in the clearing, moving slowly, almost cautiously. I froze, listening. The sound stopped and started again, coming closer to the cabin. My stomach tightened. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just a deer or some animal, but the rhythm was wrong. It was too careful, too human. I stayed in bed, holding my phone even though I had no service. I considered getting up and looking, but a part of me knew that would be dangerous. I watched the window, staring into the blackness outside. The sound came closer, now circling the cabin. My heart raced, then it stopped, and everything went quiet. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in the bed, listening, waiting, watching the windows. Dawn didn't come fast enough. When the first light touched the trees, I finally dared to get up. I looked out, but the clearing was empty. No footprints, no disturbances. I convinced myself I had imagined it, or maybe it was someone who had left during the night. But the unease stayed with me. I decided to leave the cabin that day. I packed quickly, carrying my bags to the car. As I stepped outside, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud, leading from the tree lean to the cabin door. They were larger than mine, and they stopped abruptly at the edge of the porch. My stomach dropped. I checked the car doors, the windows, everything. Nothing had been disturbed. It didn't make sense. Whoever had been there hadn't taken anything. Maybe it was a local, just curious or checking the cabin. But the deliberate way they had moved around the property didn't feel casual. I drove down the gravel road, my eyes scanning the trees constantly. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack of a branch made me tense. I reached the main road and finally had phone service. I called the cabin owner and explained what had happened. They sounded concerned but not surprised. They mentioned that sometimes people trespassed in the area, hunters, hikers, or worse, people looking for abandoned places to stay overnight. They suggested I report it to the local ranger station. I did, and they asked for a description, promising to send someone to check the property. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The isolation, the sounds, the footprints. I realized how easy it could have been for someone to hide in the forest, to watch, to wait. I had been lucky. The experience changed how I thought about being alone in remote places. Weeks later, I returned briefly to the cabin, but only during the day and with another person. We inspected the surrounding woods and found clear signs of someone moving through the area. Makeshift shelters, discarded food wrappers, and more footprints. It became clear that someone had been living nearby without permission. The rangers assured us they would monitor it, and the cabin owner increased security measures. That experience stayed with me, not as a tale of ghosts or monsters, but as a reminder of how vulnerable isolation could make you. The woods didn't need supernatural forces to feel threatening. They just needed someone patient, silent, and unnoticed. I still love nature, still seek out quiet, but I learned to respect it in a different way, to carry precautions, to trust instincts, and to remember that safety isn't guaranteed, even in a place that seems perfect. The cabin trip ended up as planned, in the sense that I returned safely, but the memory of the footsteps circling my cabin in the night is something I'll never forget. I realized then that the real terror isn't always something imagined. It's the very real possibility of being watched and alone, with no one around to help. I never stayed at that cabin alone again. I still hike, still seek solitude, but now I prepare. I check my surroundings constantly, leave notes of my location, and make sure someone knows where I am. The experience was a lesson in vigilance, in understanding how quiet places can hide threats, and in valuing life's small safety nets. In the end, I made it out safely, and I never forgot the lessons of that October night. The cabin is still there, quiet and inviting, but I can't go back alone. I learned that some places are more dangerous than they seem, not because of myths or legends, but because the world is filled with people, and not all of them are harmless. I had been driving for hours, the sun long gone behind the thick line of mountains that hemmed in the narrow valley where the cabin stood. The forest pressed close to the road, dense and dark, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself I needed to escape the city, the noise, and the constant pressure of work. The idea of being completely alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, had seemed comforting at first. Now, as I approached the cabin, a subtle unease began to creep into my chest. The cabin itself was small, made of rough, dark wood that had weathered many winters. It sat at the edge of a clearing, the forest crowding around it on all sides. The porch sagged slightly, and the steps leading up to it were uneven, moss covering parts of the wood. It was the kind of place you might pass by quickly and not think twice about, except that it had a kind of quiet presence, almost as if it were watching the forest as much as the forest watched it. I parked my car on the narrow dirt track and got out, stretching my legs. The air was cooler here, the way it always was when the sun set behind mountains and left shadows to stretch and settle over everything. I pushed open the cabin door, which creaked loudly, echoing strangely in the empty space inside. The air smelled of old wood, dust, and a faint trace of dampness. It was clear no one had been here for a while. I set my bag down, taking in the interior. There was a small living area with a fireplace, though it was filled with old ashes and bits of charred wood. A couple of chairs and a table sat against the walls, and beyond that, a narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom and a small kitchen. Nothing had electricity except for a single lantern that hung near the kitchen counter. I hadn't expected much, but this was more rustic than I had imagined. Still, it felt safe enough, or at least it should have. I spent the next hour unpacking, organizing my things, and inspecting the cabin. The walls were solid, the roof intact, and the windows, though dusty, had no cracks. I made a small pile of firewood near the fireplace, checking that the matches in my pack were dry. I had brought canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I told myself I was prepared. I had done this before, camping alone, hiking alone, but there was something about being inside a permanent structure in the middle of a forest that made the usual noises. Branches snapping, wind rustling leaves, sound different. More deliberate, more purposeful. As night fell completely, I lit the lantern and set it on the table. Its weak, yellow light cast long shadows across the walls, making every corner look like it was hiding something just out of sight. I had planned to sleep early, but I couldn't stop myself from walking around the cabin again, checking locks, examining the windows, and listening. The forest was alive with sound. The call of an owl, the skittering of small animals, the rustle of branches. It was normal, I told myself, but every once in a while, I thought I heard something heavier, something that didn't belong to the small, light-footed animals. A low thud, maybe, or a footstep breaking through the underbrush. My stomach twisted at the thought, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. It was just my imagination. I decided to try and sleep. I laid out my sleeping bag on the small bed in the bedroom, the mattress thin and firm. The lantern was placed near the table so I could reach it easily. I had always slept lightly when I was alone in the woods, but tonight, every small sound seemed amplified. The wind moaned through the trees, and the old wooden floorboards of the cabin creaked under their own weight, or so I told myself. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing, the steady in and out, but my mind kept wandering to the shadows outside the window. Every shape seemed like it might move, every shadow might step closer. Hours passed, and sleep eventually came, light and fragmented. I dreamt of walking through the forest, always moving but never leaving the darkness behind. When I woke, the cabin was silent except for the faint whistle of wind. Morning light had begun to filter through the dusty windows. Relief flooded through me. The first night had been tense, but I had survived it. I made myself a simple breakfast from canned beans and bread, sitting at the table while I listened to the sounds of the forest waking. Birds, small animals, the distant rush of a stream. It was peaceful in a way the city never could be. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick, and the trees tall and close together. I walked carefully, keeping an eye on the ground for roots and rocks that could trip me. The forest felt alive, more so than any park or trail I had ever visited. There were subtle changes in the soil, animal tracks, and the smell of wet earth after last night's rain. I followed a narrow path that seemed to have been used before, though rarely. After about an hour, I reached a small creek. Water trickled over rocks, clear and cold, reflecting the sun in tiny glints. I knelt, splashing water on my face, and paused to listen. The forest was quiet here, calm, yet it felt like it had been waiting for me to come closer, to step further in. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint light through the trees. My heart lifted. Maybe it was the cabin. I ran toward it, tripping over roots, my hands scraping against bark and rocks. When I finally emerged into the clearing, the light was gone. The cabin I had parked at hours before was nowhere in sight. Panic hit me fully now. I was lost, truly lost, and the forest was closing in. I tried to calm myself, breathing deeply, thinking logically. I remembered a trick. If I couldn't find my way back, I should stay put, make a shelter, and wait until morning. I gathered branches and leaves, building a crude barrier against the wind. The temperature dropped sharply, and I shivered, my teeth chattering. I wrapped my jacket tightly around me and sat down, trying to make myself comfortable on the cold forest floor. The night was alive with sound. The wind through the trees, the hoot of an owl, the distant rustle of animals moving unseen. Every sound made me tense. I stayed awake almost the entire night, listening, waiting, hoping. Morning brought relief, though not complete. I felt exhausted, my muscles sore from crawling through underbrush and climbing over fallen trees. I decided to try moving again, keeping the rising sun to my back. I marked my trail with stones, hoping to avoid circling in place. Hours passed. I climbed a ridge, hoping for a view that might reveal the cabin or a road. Finally, I saw smoke in the distance. My heart leapt. I ran toward it, desperate. It was another cabin, smaller than the one I had rented, and there was a man tending a small fire outside. Relief flooded me as I approached. He looked up, wary, but I didn't care. I waved my arms, signaling I needed help. He came over cautiously, and I explained, gesturing, showing my confusion and exhaustion. He nodded and offered me water and a seat. After resting, he agreed to guide me back to the cabin I had rented. The walk back was tense but manageable. The man knew the forest well and led me through hidden paths and trails. The cabin appeared eventually, exactly where I had left it, as if it had been waiting quietly. I was shaken but immensely grateful. I realized how unprepared I had been, how fragile my sense of safety really was. The experience left a mark on me that I would never forget. The isolation, the disorientation, the raw fear of being alone in the wilderness. I spent the remaining days in the cabin cautiously. I didn't wander far. I kept a fire burning constantly, checked my supplies repeatedly, and made sure I knew my paths and landmarks. The forest felt different now, familiar in its danger. By the end of the weekend, I packed up and left with a deep respect for the mountains and the solitude I had sought. I returned to the city, tired but alive, with a story I would never tell lightly, a memory of fear tempered by survival, a lesson in preparation and awareness that I would carry with me forever. Even years later, I remember that weekend vividly. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle in the bushes, every shadow cast in the fading light brings back the feeling of isolation, the thin line between adventure and danger, and the intense relief of finding safety when you have lost everything familiar. It was a simple, human fear, grounded in reality, and I learned from it that being alone in the wild demands more respect, more preparation, and more humility than I had ever imagined. It was late autumn when I decided to take a break from my routine life in the city. The days were getting shorter, the air colder, and I was craving silence, a place where I could be alone and think without the constant noise of traffic and people. I found a small cabin online, listed as off-grid, deep in the mountains, a place with no neighbors for miles. The photos showed a modest wooden structure, surrounded by dense forest, with a creek running nearby. It looked perfect, isolated, and I thought I would be completely alone for a few days. I rented it for a week. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The road started as a paved two-lane highway, then narrowed to gravel, and finally became a rough dirt track with deep ruts and puddles from the recent rains. My car bounced over rocks and mud, and I had to be careful to avoid getting stuck. The sun was low in the sky when I finally reached the place. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick trees. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney, though I later realized it was just a piece of moss hanging over the vent. The place had been empty for weeks. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the weight of the isolation. The air was damp and smelled of wet leaves and decaying wood. There was no wind, no birds, no animals, nothing moving except the slight ripple of the creek. I walked around the cabin, checking the structure. The wood was weathered, some boards creaking under my weight. The windows were dirty, and the door's lock was rusted. Still, it seemed solid enough. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. Dust covered the floorboards, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bed with a thin mattress, and a wood-burning stove. There was a small stack of firewood in the corner and a bucket with a few empty cans inside. I pulled my backpack off and began unpacking, trying to shake off the uneasy feelings settling in my chest. The first night, I slept poorly. The silence was oppressive. Every small sound, branches tapping against the roof, the creek splashing over rocks, sounded amplified in the quiet. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard someone outside. I reminded myself I was alone, that the nearest road was miles away, and that no one could have possibly reached the cabin in the dark without leaving tracks. Eventually, I drifted off, but I woke several times, heart racing, as I imagined shadows moving across the windows. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I hiked through the forest, sticking close to the creek at first, enjoying the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The trees were tall, and the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. I found some animal tracks, mostly deer and raccoon prints, and the occasional mark of a larger predator, probably a bear. I noted their locations but didn't think much of it. This was wilderness. Seeing signs of wildlife was normal. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something I had missed before. There were footprints in the mud near the door. They were not mine. My heart jumped. I traced them carefully. They were small, maybe from someone who had been wearing boots. They led from the tree line to the cabin and back again. I had been careful not to leave the road, so whoever had made them must have approached through the forest. I felt my stomach tighten, a cold knot forming. I went inside and locked the door, even though the lock was flimsy. I checked the windows. Nothing seemed broken, nothing taken. But the footprints were real. Someone had been there. I spent the next day gathering firewood and securing the cabin as best as I could. I moved some of the furniture near the windows to make barricades, though I knew it would not stop anyone determined to enter. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, only a faint bar if I climbed the hill behind the cabin. I debated going back down the road to get help, but the forest was thick, and it would take hours. Besides, I wanted to stay. I had imagined this trip for weeks. Solitude, peace, and I didn't want to abandon it. The third night was worse. I woke to a noise outside, something scratching against the door. My first thought was an animal, but the scratches were deliberate, slow, methodical. Someone was testing the door. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few moments. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. I didn't sleep that night, sitting in the dark with a flashlight across my lap, clutching a kitchen knife I had found in a drawer. Every small sound made me jump. The creek, branches, the wind through the trees. That evening, I prepared a fire. The process was simple, familiar, almost meditative. I stacked the logs carefully, struck the match, and fed the growing flame. The cabin glowed warmly, the light pushing back the shadows in the corners. I sat in a chair near the fireplace, my feet resting on the cold wooden floor, feeling a strange combination of comfort and unease. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward, and I watched as the room shifted with each movement of the flames. I reminded myself again that everything was normal. The noises outside, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. It was all natural, nothing more. But that night, the sounds became harder to ignore. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed from outside. They weren't light, like the movement of deer or raccoons. They were too slow, too careful. I froze each time I thought I heard them. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, the floor settling, the wind playing tricks. But the rhythm continued, and I realized it was too consistent to be random. My pulse quickened. I remembered the small hunting knives in my pack, the fire poker beside the fireplace. I gripped one of them, trying to calm my breathing, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. Hours passed like this. Every small sound became a potential threat. I refused to sleep, moving only to check the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked. I kept the lantern lit, feeding the fire to maintain light. Morning came slowly, casting weak gray light through the windows. Exhausted, I decided to leave the cabin, at least to explore the forest in daylight and regain some sense of normalcy. As I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the forest alive with movement. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, scanning for signs of anyone or anything. Then I saw it, footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They were large, booted, and had come through the clearing toward the cabin. My heart sank. I realized that whatever had been outside the night before was real. Someone had been following me, perhaps even watching me all day. Fear surged, sharp and cold. I needed a plan. I couldn't stay here, not with someone potentially in the forest. I returned to the cabin and packed quickly, grabbing food, water, and essentials. The fire I had so carefully built was left to burn itself out. I loaded my bag into the car and started the engine, scanning the forest as I prepared to leave. The road was narrow, winding, and every shadow seemed alive with potential threats. I drove slowly, listening for the crunch of footsteps behind me or the movement of someone following. But the forest remained quiet, holding its secrets close. Eventually, the road widened, and the first signs of civilization appeared. A small town, a gas station, a few cars. Relief washed over me in heavy waves. I pulled into the station, parked, and finally allowed myself to breathe freely. The city, with its noise and crowds, felt like safety, a strange reversal of what I had always thought. The cabin, the forest, the isolation. It had been a test of endurance, and I had survived, but the memory of those footsteps, the sense of being watched, lingered long after I left. In the days that followed, I told myself I had imagined much of it, that the forest was just alive with ordinary animals and the wind. But when I checked the pictures I had taken of the cabin, one of them showed something I hadn't noticed at the time. A shadow, blurred and dark, standing just beyond the treeline. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't fairy tale. It was human. And for a long time after, I could not stop thinking about who it had been, and whether they were still out there, waiting for the next person who came too close to the cabin in the woods. I had survived, yes, but the forest had changed for me forever. Safety was no longer a certainty, and silence was never just silence again. I remember the drive up to the cabin like it was yesterday. The road was narrow and winding, carved into the side of the mountain, and the trees pressed close to the asphalt on both sides. Their shadows fell across my windshield, stretching long and dark in the late afternoon sun. I had rented the cabin through a small online listing, advertised as secluded, quiet, and perfect for a weekend away from everything. I had been craving that, the escape from constant noise, from city streets packed with cars, the endless demands of work and social life. The idea of a weekend in the mountains, alone with nothing but a small stack of books, some food, and the woods around me, had seemed perfect. I had no idea how quickly that peace would turn into fear. The last stretch of the road was barely more than dirt, pocked with rocks and deep ruts that made my car bounce violently. I had to slow to a crawl, holding my hands tight on the wheel. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned, giving me glimpses of the valley below, shrouded in mist. It was beautiful, almost surreal. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and somewhere in the distance, a river glinted in the sunlight. The air smelled fresh, pine-heavy, and clean. When I finally saw the cabin, my heart lifted. It was small and wooden, with a porch that ran across the front and a chimney that promised warmth inside. The windows were dusty, and the wood had darkened with age, but it had character. It looked like the kind of place where no one came often, the kind of place that felt untouched. I parked my car in the narrow clearing in front, my tires crunching on dry leaves. I stepped out and breathed deeply. The air was cold, sharper than I expected for early autumn, but invigorating. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The furniture was simple. A small table, a couple of chairs, a couch with faded fabric, a bed with a thick quilt folded at the foot. There was a wood stove in the corner, blackened from use. The walls were bare except for a few old photographs in cracked frames. Everything felt still, untouched, almost frozen in time. I unpacked my things slowly, savoring the quiet. I filled a kettle with water, stacked firewood beside the stove, and built a small fire. Flames flickered, casting warm shadows across the room. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and I felt a comforting isolation. That night, I slept fitfully. The creaking of the cabin, the rustle of leaves outside, and the occasional snap of a branch kept me half awake. Every time the wind rattled the windows, my heart skipped. But I told myself it was just the house settling, just the forest doing what forests do. Morning brought light and relief. I opened the windows, letting in the crisp mountain air, and brewed coffee over the stove. I planned to hike that day, explore the trails marked on the old map I had found in the cabin. The hike was pleasant at first. I followed a narrow path through the trees, listening to birds and the occasional distant sound of water. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. But after a while, the trail became harder to follow. The markers were faded or missing entirely, and the path narrowed into nothing more than a thin track. I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I turned around, thinking I could retrace my steps, but everything looked different. Trees that had seemed familiar now towered over me in strange angles, and shadows fell in directions that made the forest feel alien. I began to worry. My phone had no signal, and my map was old and worn. The sun was beginning to dip, and I had no idea how long it would take to get back. The forest grew colder as I climbed, the shadows longer and darker. Every sound made me jump. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. My pulse quickened. I told myself to stay calm, that panicking would make it harder to think. I kept moving, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. By the time I stumbled back onto a slightly wider trail, the sun was nearly gone. Darkness fell quickly in the forest, and I realized I had no torch. I had brought only a small flashlight, but its batteries were weak. I cursed myself for not preparing better. I tried to retrace my steps toward the cabin, but the trail seemed to twist in ways that made no sense. Every bend, every hill looked unfamiliar. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Shadows danced in the flashlight's weak beam, and I felt eyes watching me, though I knew there was no one else around. Night came, and with it the full weight of isolation. I barricaded the door with a chair, moved the table in front of it as well, and sat in the corner, my back to the wall. I kept a small kitchen knife next to me. The fire in the stove flickered and danced, casting shadows across the walls. Couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. I heard it then. A soft scraping sound outside, slow, deliberate. Footsteps? Something being dragged? Couldn't tell. My mind raced, imagining every possible threat. The footsteps circled the cabin, stopping at the back, then moving along the side. I didn't dare go to the window. I stayed crouched, holding the knife, barely breathing. Hours passed like this, each minute stretching into an eternity. At some point, the footsteps stopped. There was nothing. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I finally fell into a fitful sleep, fully dressed, knife in hand, sitting on the floor. Morning came slowly. Light seeped through the windows, and the forest outside looked calm, almost inviting, like nothing had happened. I checked the perimeter of the cabin. No footprints except mine. No sign of anyone ever being there. I felt some relief, but it was fragile. I packed my bags, decided not to explore anymore, and left the cabin. As I drove down the mountain, I noticed something on the rearview mirror, a small smear of red on the glass. I thought I had imagined it, but the longer I looked, the more certain I became that it was real. A tiny streak like blood. My stomach dropped. I didn't look back, just drove. I told myself it was probably from a bird or some kind of accident, and tried to calm down. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the door, the scraping. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep well. I kept imagining the cabin, imagining someone hiding in the forest, watching, waiting. I never went back. Months later, I read a local news report. A man had been living illegally in the forest, moving from cabin to cabin, stealing food, supplies, sometimes following hikers or campers. He had been arrested when authorities found a hidden camp near a creek, with stolen items from multiple cabins. They said he often broke in quietly at night, watching people, sometimes leaving evidence behind to unsettle them, enjoying the fear. Everything clicked. The footprints, the open door, the scraping at night. I had been lucky, incredibly lucky. I hadn't seen him, hadn't encountered him directly. He had been close, too close, but I survived without a confrontation. That knowledge was both terrifying and relieving. I realized I had underestimated the isolation, the risk of being completely alone in a place no one could hear me scream. But I also realized that small precautions, staying alert, trusting instincts, and keeping calm were what kept me alive. I never returned to the cabin. I never want to, but the memory stayed with me. I replay it often, every detail. The smell of the cabin, the feel of the forest, the sound of the creek, the shadowed path, the footprints. I learned a lot from it. I learned that the forest can be beautiful and deadly at the same time, that isolation can magnify fear, and that some people are willing to hide in the shadows to watch the world go by, unnoticed, unseen, untouchable. Most of all, I learned that luck and awareness are sometimes the only things standing between you and danger. Even now, when I drive past the mountains, I avoid that area entirely. I don't want to think about what might have happened if he had been braver, more reckless, or if I had been careless. I survived, and for that I am grateful, but I am also forever changed. The cabin, the forest, the footsteps, they are etched into me. Reminders that reality is often scarier than any story you could imagine. I had been driving for hours along the winding forest roads, the kind that seemed to stretch endlessly through thick pine woods, with no sign of human life except for the occasional deer crossing. The air outside the car smelled damp and earthy, a mixture of pine needles, wet soil, and the faint hint of smoke from distant, unseen chimneys. I had planned this trip weeks in advance. My life had become monotonous and suffocating. Work, city noise, the constant barrage of screens and people. I needed solitude, something raw and untouched. The cabin I had rented was deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, a place that promised isolation and the quiet I craved. The GPS had started to fail about 30 minutes back, the signal bouncing in and out as if the forest itself resisted any intrusion of technology. That wasn't unusual for a cabin this remote, but it did make me a little uneasy. There was a small paper map in the glove compartment, and I had memorized the route. A long, winding road, then a dirt track over a small creek, and finally a clearing where the cabin sat on a rise, overlooking a valley below. The sun was already dipping low, streaking the sky in orange and deep purples. I had hoped to reach the cabin before dark, but the forest seemed denser than I remembered from the photos, and the shadows were growing quickly. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight of the cabin made me feel a strange mix of relief and apprehension. It was an old structure, weathered and sturdy, made of dark wood that had faded almost gray over the years. The windows were small and shuttered, and smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney. The surrounding trees pressed close to the clearing, like silent sentinels. There was a thin layer of fallen leaves and pine needles covering the ground, soft underfoot but rustling sharply whenever I moved. I parked the car near the edge of the clearing, and the gravel crunched loudly in the quiet evening. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and approached the cabin. The air smelled of damp wood, smoke, and the faint tang of moss. The front door was heavy and made of thick timber. I could see scratches along the bottom edge, probably from animals. I unlocked it with a key that had been left in a lockbox as instructed, and the door creaked open. Inside, the cabin smelled musty but lived in. There was a small kitchen to the left with a wood-burning stove, a sink, and a few shelves lined with canned goods. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn rug, and a couple of chairs that had seen better days. A narrow staircase led to a loft, presumably where the sleeping quarters were. I set my backpack down and started unpacking, arranging food, water, and gear neatly on the counter. I was struck by how quiet it was. No cars, no distant voices, not even the sound of birds. The only noise was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional snapping of a branch under my own feet. I told myself it was exactly the isolation I wanted, but a small part of me felt exposed. I decided to light a fire in the fireplace. The wood smelled dry and sharp, and as the flames caught, the cabin warmed quickly. Shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and shrinking as the fire danced. I made a small meal and ate it slowly, listening to the forest outside. The wind was picking up now, making the branches sway and tap against the cabin walls. I finished eating and washed my dishes, then settled in one of the chairs with a blanket. I felt the weight of the day pressing down, my body tired, my mind restless. Night had fallen completely, and the darkness outside was absolute. The only light came from the fire and the occasional flashlight beam as I checked the doors and windows. I kept thinking I heard something moving outside, but every time I went to the window, there was nothing. I told myself it was just the forest, animals, branches, the wind. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying every sound. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. Somewhere in the night, I heard a scraping noise at the back door. It was faint at first, almost like a branch being dragged, but it became more deliberate, more rhythmic. My heart started to pound. I knew the door was locked, the bolt secure, but I couldn't stop imagining someone, or something, moving outside. I picked up a heavy flashlight and crept toward the door. Every step made the floorboards groan under my weight. During the morning, I inspected the perimeter carefully. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin, human footprints, boot prints. They were large and they came from the forest, around the back of the cabin, and then disappeared. I felt my stomach tighten. I was alone, miles from any road or neighbor. Whoever had been here could still be nearby. I searched the cabin for anything I could use for defense. There was a small hatchet in the kitchen, some kitchen knives, and a heavy cast iron skillet. Not ideal, but it was something. I resolved to stay inside as much as possible, and if I had to go outside, I would carry the hatchet with me. I didn't call anyone yet. I still had patchy cell service, and calling might draw attention. I decided to wait and observe. I kept all doors locked, the windows checked, and the fireplace poker nearby. The second night was worse. The footsteps returned, deliberate and slow, circling the cabin over and over. The scratching at the walls began again, this time in multiple spots. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves under boots, movement that suggested someone was trying to learn the layout of the cabin without actually entering. I stayed still, heart pounding, flashlight in hand, waiting for a moment to act if necessary. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep. Eventually, the noises faded as dawn approached, but the tension never left me. I could feel the cabin was no longer mine. It had become a place of watchfulness, a trap if I made a wrong move. The following day, I resolved to leave. I couldn't wait for the week to pass while someone potentially lurked around the property. I packed essential supplies into my backpack, including food, water, flashlight, and the hatchet. I intended to hike down the gravel road to where I could get a cell signal and call for help. I stayed low and moved carefully, checking the forest as I went. I didn't see anyone, but the footprints I had found before were still fresh, suggesting someone had been observing me. I tried to stay calm, keeping my senses sharp. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I walked faster, and the anxiety kept me alert. About 2 hours into the hike, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. I froze. It was a man, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, partially hidden behind the thick brush. He wasn't approaching, but he was watching me. My heart raced. I kept walking slowly, making no sudden movements. He mirrored me, keeping his distance, never leaving the cover of the trees. I thought of calling out, but I knew that could provoke him. My instinct was to stay calm, to keep moving toward the road. After a few minutes, he disappeared back into the forest. I didn't stop. My legs ached, and my lungs burned, but I couldn't allow myself to pause. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the road. From there, I could see the faint outline of my truck parked at the edge of the gravel path. Relief washed over me, though my body was tense and trembling. When I got to the truck, I locked the doors immediately. I checked my phone. Weak signal, but enough to call 911. I reported the situation, explaining that someone had been stalking me at the cabin. Within the hour, I saw flashing lights approaching down the gravel road. Police arrived, and I guided them to the cabin. They searched the area thoroughly but found no one. The footprints had vanished, and the cabin appeared empty. They said it was possible the person had seen me leave and retreated, but they took my statement and assured me patrols would check the area. I stayed in my truck until they left, and when I finally drove away, the weight of exhaustion hit me. I felt shaken but safe for now. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and those nights of fear. The thought that someone could be watching, moving silently outside, left a lasting unease. I returned home, unpacked, and slowly got back to normal life, though I remained cautious. I realized how quickly a quiet, isolated place could turn threatening, how easy it was to be vulnerable when alone. I never returned to that cabin, and I warned others who rented similar places to be vigilant, to check perimeters, and to trust instincts when something feels off. The experience left me with a deep respect for solitude, but also a caution. Isolation can hide dangers more real than any ghost story, dangers that are very human and very close. Even now, when I think of the cabin, I can remember the sound of footsteps circling in the dark, the scrape of a branch against the wall, the feeling of being watched, and the sharp, relentless awareness of my own vulnerability. It taught me to prepare, to be aware, and to never underestimate the quiet, hidden threats that can exist in the wilderness. That cabin is gone from my life now, but the memory is sharp, and the lessons remain. Safety isn't just about having supplies. It's about vigilance, presence, and knowing when to leave. And I left, fully aware, fully determined to survive, and fully alive. I had been planning this trip for months. The thought of leaving the city behind, with its constant noise, its unrelenting pressure, and the endless flood of people, made me almost euphoric. I had always been the type who found peace in isolation, and this cabin, this small, weathered structure tucked into the forest far from any road, promised the perfect escape. It was an old family friend's place, someone I barely knew anymore, who had said I could use it as long as I promised to respect the property. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. A single room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen corner, and a lofted bed that creaked under even the slightest movement. But it was enough. I had enough supplies to last a week, maybe more, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the forest for a while, to breathe, to be quiet. The first day was pleasant. The sun was high, and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. I unloaded my car slowly, making sure I had everything in its place. My bag with clothes, a small cooler, camping stove, plenty of bottled water, a first aid kit, and the hunting knife my uncle had given me years ago. I unpacked methodically, almost ceremoniously, placing things in exact spots. It gave me a strange sense of calm. Once I was finished, I stepped outside, and the forest seemed to close around me. The trees were dense, the kind that filtered sunlight into muted golden patterns on the ground. I could hear a creek somewhere to my left, its water running fast and steady. I thought about walking to it, maybe dipping my feet, but decided against it. I wanted to settle in first. I wanted to feel like the cabin was mine, at least for now. Evening came, and the forest began to darken faster than I expected. The The sun dropped behind the hills, and shadows crept along the ground like silent animals. I lit the fireplace, and the cabin filled with warmth and a soft glow. I had brought some food: canned beans, pasta, bread, and a few snacks. Cooking over the small stove was tedious but satisfying, and I took my time. After eating, I sat in the corner by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. It was peaceful in a way I had almost forgotten. The wind outside made the trees sway, producing a soft, rustling symphony that I found comforting. I went to bed early, exhausted but content. It was around midnight that things started to feel different. I woke up suddenly, my stomach tightening for no reason I could identify. At first, I thought it was just a dream fading away, leaving me disoriented. But then I heard it. A scraping sound, faint but distinct, coming from outside the cabin. I froze, listening. My heart started to beat faster, but I tried to calm myself. Animals lived in the forest. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a bear. The sound was probably one of them, nothing more. Still, the scratching persisted, irregular but persistent, coming closer. I got out of bed, keeping quiet, and crept toward the window. The darkness outside made it almost impossible to see, but I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. A shadow, tall, slow, deliberate. I could not identify it, but it was big enough to make me hesitate. My rational mind told me it was probably nothing. A deer scratching a tree or a raccoon digging through leaves, but a deeper part of me knew that something about the movement felt wrong. I tried to ignore it and return to bed, telling myself I was imagining things. But sleep did not come easily. Every small noise made me tense. The wind, the trees, the distant creak. They all became amplified, turning mundane sounds into threats in my mind. I lay awake until the first light of dawn, staring at the ceiling, convincing myself that I would be more alert during the day and could investigate then. I told myself I was overreacting, that nothing could happen here. But I could not shake the unease that had settled over me like a weight. Morning arrived, gray and misty. I made coffee and decided to explore the perimeter of the cabin, wanting to confirm that nothing had disturbed my space overnight. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the ground and the trees. That's when I noticed it, footprints in the soft earth. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but they were too large, too flat, and the shape was unmistakable. Human. Someone had been walking around the cabin. I felt a cold rush through me. I wasn't supposed to see anyone here. The cabin was isolated. No roads nearby, no neighbors, no one. And yet, here were footprints, fresh, leading up to the side of the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. Maybe it was a hiker, someone lost, someone harmless. But the footprints circled the cabin, as if whoever had been there had been observing, waiting. Hours later, I woke to another sound. This time, it wasn't outside, it was coming from the loft above the main room. The cabin had a small loft where some extra bedding and supplies were stored. A creaking, soft thud, like someone walking slowly on the wooden floor. My body froze, adrenaline spiking. I listened carefully. The sound stopped after a few seconds, then came again, this time a little louder. My first instinct was to call 911, but I had no cell signal. Panic began to rise, but I forced myself to think. The loft had been empty when I checked earlier. I hadn't seen anyone else around. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and slowly approached the ladder to the loft. I shone the light upward. The wooden floorboards were empty, shadows stretching in strange angles under the beam. I climbed carefully, every creak of the ladder making me jump. When I reached the top, I shined the light across the loft. Nothing. The bedding and supplies were in place. No sign of anyone. My pulse was still racing, and I descended, deciding to barricade myself in the main room for the rest of the night. I moved the small couch against the door, pulled the blanket over myself, and tried to sleep again. Morning came, but the forest outside seemed different. The air was colder, the shadows longer, more oppressive. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it had been a raccoon or a deer or some other animal moving through the loft or on the roof. Maybe I had imagined some of it, my nerves exaggerating sounds in the dark. I decided to explore the surrounding area during daylight, hoping that being outside would help me feel safer. The forest was thick, and walking through it was difficult. The undergrowth scratched at my legs, and the ground was uneven. I followed a small, overgrown path that seemed to lead away from the cabin. After about half a mile, I found signs that someone else had been here. Footprints, old and faded but still visible in the mud, leading deeper into the woods and circling back toward the cabin. My stomach turned. I had been sure I was alone. Now I wasn't so sure. I followed the prints carefully, trying to figure out if they were recent. Some looked old, but some were fresh, as if someone had been here in the past day or two. I returned to the cabin quickly, uneasy and tense. I checked the locks, reinforced them as best I could, and tried to stay calm. That night, I stayed awake, fire burning brightly, flashlight in hand, listening to every creak and rustle. The scraping noise returned, faint at first, then louder. This time, I didn't investigate. I stayed put, heart pounding, until the noise faded into the distance. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found evidence that terrified me. On the porch, someone had left a small pile of sticks arranged in a triangle. It wasn't threatening, not directly, but it meant someone had been close enough to touch my property. I realized then that I wasn't alone in this forest, and that whoever had been following the cabin had been careful, waiting for the right moment. Panic and fear set in, but I forced myself to think rationally. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave, but the path back to the main road was long, and the forest was dense. I packed as quickly as possible, leaving most of my belongings behind. I made sure the car keys were in my pocket, the doors locked, and started the walk back to my car. The forest seemed alive with every sound amplified. The snapping of twigs under my own feet, the rustle of leaves above me, birds taking flight. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was following me, but no one was there. When I reached the car, relief washed over me. I locked the doors behind me, started the engine, and drove slowly down the overgrown path, careful not to get stuck in the mud. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was high, and the forest looked less threatening in daylight. Still, the fear lingered. I drove all the way back to civilization, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my eyes constantly scanning the forest edges for movement. When I finally reached a town, I pulled into a gas station, breathed deeply, and realized I had survived something far more dangerous than I had imagined. The cabin had been isolated, yes, but that isolation had made me vulnerable. I had underestimated how easily someone could hide, observe, and get close without being noticed. I never returned to that cabin. Months later, I learned that a man had been arrested for breaking into remote cabins in the area, targeting solo visitors. He had been living in the forest, watching cabins, studying patterns, waiting for opportunities. That knowledge explained everything. The sounds at night, the footprints, the carefully placed sticks. I had been lucky. I hadn't been attacked, but I had come terrifyingly close. The forest was quiet again in my memory, but I could still hear the scraping, the faint creak of the loft, and feel the cold fear that had settled in my chest during that week. I never stayed in a cabin alone after that. I still visit the forest sometimes, but always with someone else, never forgetting how easily safety can be an illusion in a place designed for solitude. It started as a simple weekend getaway. I had found a small cabin listed online, tucked away deep in the mountains, far from any town or road. The pictures were perfect. A rustic wooden cabin surrounded by dense pine forest, a small creek running nearby, and a wraparound porch that promised quiet mornings with coffee and nothing but the sound of wind in the trees. I had planned this trip for weeks, longing to escape the constant noise of the city, the emails, the honking cars, the endless chatter of people I didn't even care to talk to. I imagined myself alone, completely disconnected, living for a couple of days just in the rhythm of nature. The drive up the mountain was long and winding. The sun was starting to drop low, spilling orange and red light across the horizon. As I turned off the main road onto a gravel track, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows of the pines stretched across the dirt path, moving as the wind shook the branches. The car tires crunched over loose rocks, and I felt the kind of nervous excitement that comes from leaving everything familiar behind. The cabin finally appeared, exactly as it had in the pictures, but in person it seemed smaller, more isolated, and somehow heavier, as if the forest itself had claimed it. I parked and got out. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of wet soil and pine sap. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance. The windows were dark. The wood had the slightly gray tint of weathered timber, and the porch had leaves scattered across it, untouched. I walked up the steps and pushed open the door. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust or iron. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the season and the cabin not being used for months. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A single living area with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen with a sink and a counter, a table and 2 chairs. There was a loft above with a bed and a few shelves. Everything was basic, but clean enough. I set my bags down and started a fire in the stove, appreciating the sudden warmth. The first night was quiet, almost painfully quiet. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through cracks in the walls, the soft patter of something small moving outside, maybe a squirrel or bird. I tried to read, to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The darkness outside was complete. Even the stars were partially hidden behind thick clouds. I slept fitfully, waking several times to strange noises. Some were normal. The wind rattling the roof, the creek outside gurgling, branches scraping against the cabin walls. But others were harder to place. A soft thud, almost like footsteps around the cabin, or the sound of a door creaking open and then closing. I told myself it was nothing, that the cabin was old and settling, that animals were moving around outside. I had no choice but to convince myself because the isolation was absolute. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, no phone service at all. I couldn't call for anyone, couldn't even check the time online. I was alone, truly alone, and that made every small sound impossible to ignore. The second day, I decided to explore. I left the cabin mid-morning, the sun breaking through the clouds in beams that cut through the mist hanging over the forest floor. The trail behind the cabin was barely visible, overgrown in places, but I pushed through anyway. I wanted to see the creek up close, maybe take pictures, maybe just wander. The forest was dense, and soon I realized how little I actually knew about the area. There were no signs, no markers, just trees, rocks, and underbrush. Every step made a noise, twigs snapping underfoot, leaves crunching. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew logically it was impossible. Deer, maybe bears, raccoons, all plausible, but the feeling persisted. By mid-afternoon, I reached the creek. It was beautiful, the water clear and cold, rushing over stones, creating small pools. I knelt to fill my water bottle and noticed something odd. Footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks. Human. I froze, looking around. There was no one, but the prints were fresh, still damp from the creek. I felt my heart start to race, imagining all kinds of scenarios, all of them bad. Someone else was here, in the middle of nowhere. Maybe someone had been watching the cabin. Maybe they were still nearby. I went back quickly, trying to keep calm, convincing myself the tracks were old, that maybe a hiker had passed days ago. But when I got back to the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door was slightly ajar. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I had locked it. Inside, nothing had been taken. Nothing appeared out of place. But the feeling of being watched had shifted into full-blown fear. I checked the windows. Nothing outside. The forest was silent. I sat down, trying to make sense of it, trying to calm myself. But every little sound, the wind, the creak, a branch tapping against the window, made my chest tighten. I thought about leaving immediately, driving back down the mountain while I still could. But the thought of moving in the dark forest, alone with someone possibly nearby, was terrifying too. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I walked down the path toward the lake, noticing the dense forest pressing in on both sides. The trees were old and tall, with roots that twisted across the ground like veins. The air was cool and damp, and I could see fog rising from patches of wet earth. The lake was small but clear, reflecting the gray sky and the shadows of the surrounding trees. I spent the day walking along the edge of the water, taking in the strange, unsettling feeling of being completely alone. There were no other people, no distant cabins, nothing except the forest and the lake. I tried to relax, reminding myself that I had chosen this isolation. By the evening, the sun had vanished entirely, leaving only the dim light of the moon through the trees. I lit the fireplace again, this time keeping it burning longer. That's when I first noticed the other noises, the ones that weren't natural. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sounds were different. Something was moving outside, close to the cabin, too deliberate for the wind. Footsteps, perhaps, or a branch snapping under weight. I froze, listening. The sounds stopped. I waited, heart pounding, telling myself it had to be a deer or some other animal. I stayed up most of the night, fire crackling, eyes scanning the dark outside through the windows. The next day, I went further into the woods, keeping track of the path carefully. I noticed signs that something or someone had been in the area recently. Broken branches, footprints in the damp soil, small piles of disturbed leaves. I rationalized it as animals, though part of me knew human footprints looked different. My unease grew with each step. I returned to the cabin before dark, making sure I had my flashlight and a small knife I kept in my pocket. That night, the sounds returned, louder, closer, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, the brush snapping as if something large was moving through it. My sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of being trapped, of someone or something watching me from the trees. The following morning, I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. The forest seemed thicker on the far side, darker, almost impenetrable. That's when I saw it. Faint footprints leading away from the cabin, almost hidden in the soft dirt near the back door. They weren't animal prints. They were human, large, uneven, as if someone had been moving quietly, trying not to be seen. I felt my stomach twist. I was alone, or so I had thought. Whoever had been here, they were nearby, and I had no way to know how long they had been watching me. I packed my things hastily, preparing for the possibility of leaving. But leaving wasn't simple. The road was 20 miles back, over that same dirt track, and I had no guarantee I would be safe along the way. I resolved to stay alert and fortify the cabin. I moved heavy furniture in front of the doors, checked the windows, and kept the fire going for light. I also began to gather small supplies, water, food, anything that might help me survive if I had to spend another night hiding. That night was the worst. The footsteps returned, this time with deliberate purpose, circling the cabin slowly, stopping at intervals. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the scrape of something heavy against wood. Every time I peered out the window, I saw shadows moving just beyond the edge of the light. The fear was suffocating, my mind racing with every possible scenario. What would I do if someone tried to get in? Should I run, hide, or fight? I stayed crouched near the fireplace, knife in hand, fire casting trembling shadows across the walls. Hours passed, each minute stretching endlessly, until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees. In the morning, I cautiously stepped outside. The footprints were gone, but signs of someone's presence remained. A branch had been broken near the back door, dirt disturbed around the porch. The realization hit me that I had been watched, maybe even for days, and that the person had likely retreated only when the sunlight came. Panic set in. I could no longer stay at the cabin. I had to leave. I spent the day preparing. I packed my car with everything I could carry, keeping one eye on the surrounding trees. I made sure the doors were locked, but I left nothing behind that could be used against me. As dusk approached, I started the drive back, adrenaline keeping me alert. Every sound along the dirt road made my heart jump. The wind, an animal, even my own tires crunching on the gravel. I drove slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows, knowing that any person could be following me. Hours later, I reached the main road and finally saw the glow of distant town lights. Relief washed over me, though exhaustion kept me on edge. I had survived the night, survived being watched and trapped in that isolated cabin, and I had learned a lesson about isolation and the fragility of perceived safety. I called the local authorities, explained the situation, and they assured me they would check the area, though I never stayed to see what they found. By the time I reached my apartment back in the city, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The memory of the dark forest, the silent footsteps, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. It took weeks before I could look at the cabin photos online without a shiver. I realized that the forest, while beautiful, could hide dangers far more real than I had imagined. That experience changed me. I became far more cautious, far more aware of the world beyond the controlled, predictable city environment I was used to. Even now, years later, I can recall the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin, the weight of the isolation, and the cold, quiet fear that filled me. But I survived. I left the cabin behind, returned to safety, and carried the lessons with me. And though the experience was terrifying, it made me stronger, more vigilant, and more appreciative of the value of life and safety, even in the places where peace seems to be the only thing present. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully picking a cabin far from the nearest town, where I could be alone for a week, disconnected from the noise of everyday life. The idea of solitude in the forest, surrounded by the quiet of trees and the distant murmur of a river, had appealed to me deeply. I imagined the slow rhythm of days spent hiking, reading, and simply being in nature. I had researched the area thoroughly. Maps, weather patterns, wildlife, and even the history of the surrounding forests. Nothing had warned me about what I would face. The journey began early in the morning. The road to the cabin was long, winding, and mostly unpaved. First, it was easy enough. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the mist that hung in the valleys. Birds called from the trees, and small animals scurried in the underbrush as my car kicked up dust along the narrow trail. The GPS had a weak signal, so I had printed out detailed directions in case it failed. As I drove, I noticed how isolated everything was. Occasionally, I would pass a dirt path leading to a clearing or an old cabin, but none seemed occupied. The feeling of remoteness was both calming and slightly unnerving. By late morning, I reached a small wooden bridge crossing a creek. I stopped to check the map and noticed the water was unusually low for this time of year. The banks were muddy, and the sound of the water was faint but steady. The bridge looked old, the wood weathered and uneven, but it held my car without issue. Beyond the bridge, the road narrowed even further, winding through thick woods where the trees seemed to close in overhead. I drove cautiously, aware that any sudden swerve could send me off the dirt track into the forest. After what felt like hours, I finally spotted the cabin. It was small, constructed of logs, with a sloped roof and a stone chimney. Smoke did not rise from it, indicating it hadn't been recently used. Around it, the forest floor was carpeted with pine needles and leaves, and a thin trail led down to a nearby stream. I parked in front, noting the faint smell of damp wood and moss. The cabin seemed quiet, almost too quiet. I carried my backpack inside and began unpacking, placing my supplies carefully on the counter and arranging my sleeping bag on the floor. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire in the stone fireplace, ate a simple dinner, and watched the flames flicker against the walls. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls, but there was no sign of anything unusual. The peace was almost tangible, and I felt a sense of satisfaction. I slept lightly, waking occasionally to the sounds of small animals rustling in the underbrush, but nothing more. The following day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I had a plan to hike along a stream that ran behind the cabin, eventually connecting to a larger river about 3 miles away. The forest was thick, with fallen logs and dense undergrowth making progress slow. I moved carefully, keeping an eye out for loose rocks or unstable terrain. As I walked, I noticed signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, claw marks on tree trunks, and occasionally, the scat of larger animals. I reminded myself to stay alert. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the river. It was wider than I expected, the water running strong and cold. I followed the bank for a while, taking in the landscape, the steep cliffs on the far side, the fallen trees creating natural barriers, and the sudden drops in the riverbed. I collected some water in my bottle, filtered it, and rested on a large boulder. The sun was high, and the forest seemed calm. But then I noticed something strange. Across the river, there was a faint trail in the underbrush that appeared to have been made recently. It was narrow, almost like someone had brushed the foliage aside as they passed. I could not see anyone, and there were no footprints on my side of the river, but the trail seemed deliberate. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was an animal path, but the straightness of it felt unnatural. I returned to the cabin before dusk. As I walked, I felt the forest closing in, shadows lengthening around me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky had turned orange, then purple, and finally dark blue. I started a fire, knowing the night would be cold. I cooked a simple meal, then sat close to the flames, listening. And that's when I first heard it, the faint sound of a footstep on the path near the cabin. I froze. The sound was soft but deliberate, heavy on the dry leaves and pine needles. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the pattern was different. The footsteps were slow, measured, not the erratic sound of an animal moving. By evening, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed heavily, casting moving shadows across the cabin walls. I prepared a small fire and sat close to it, my back to the door. That's when I noticed something. Footprints outside in the dirt. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin and stopped abruptly near the porch. They weren't deer tracks, not raccoon tracks. They were human, and there were at least 2 sets. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe hikers had wandered off the trail. But the prints looked fresh, wet from morning dew, disturbed soil still soft. I spent the night awake, sitting in the corner with a heavy metal flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other. Every sound made me flinch. The wind howled, branches tapped the windows, and the floorboards groaned under the weight of the house. At one point, I swore I heard a footstep on the porch. I gripped the flashlight tighter, ready to swing the hatchet. The night passed in a blur of fear and tension. Dawn was a relief. The first rays of sun brought a false sense of security, washing the cabin in soft light and making the forest outside look peaceful again. The following day, I realized I needed to investigate. I couldn't stay locked in forever, and I needed to understand if someone had been around the cabin. I walked the perimeter carefully, noting every detail. The footprints led from the forest edge directly to the porch and then vanished. I noticed more scratches on the door and the window frames, subtle but deliberate. Whoever or whatever had been here knew the layout of the cabin. The thought chilled me. I went inside, fortified the door as best I could with furniture, and stayed vigilant. That afternoon, I tried to go into the forest again. I stayed close to the cabin, circling the property, checking for any signs of recent activity. I found a few more footprints, shallow impressions that looked like someone had been watching the cabin from the trees. They never came close enough to be fully clear, always at the edge of visibility, always retreating when I approached. It was deliberate. Someone was studying me, learning my patterns, making sure I knew I wasn't alone. The night after that was worse. The wind died down, leaving the forest oppressively silent. The absence of natural noise was worse than the howling wind. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Around midnight, I heard the faintest crunch of dirt outside. I froze. The sound moved closer, careful, slow, deliberate. I gripped my flashlight and hatchet, waiting. The sound stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. My skin crawled. Whoever it was, they were patient. They were watching. I stayed still, breathing slowly, listening. After what felt like hours, the noises ceased. The morning came, and I convinced myself that maybe it was a deer or a wild animal after all, even though I knew the prints and scratches said otherwise. By the third day, I knew I couldn't just wait. I had to leave. I packed my things quickly, making sure nothing was left behind that could be used to track me. As I walked to the car, I noticed the footprints again. They followed me partway, but stopped once I was close to the road. I didn't look back. I drove slowly, scanning the trees, heart racing, until I reached the highway. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, to feel relief. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the footprints, scratches, and the sense of being watched. They took notes and promised to investigate, though I knew chances were slim. The area was remote, with limited surveillance and few witnesses. I never returned to that cabin, and I made sure to research any rental carefully before staying somewhere alone again. The experience stayed with me. For weeks, I felt eyes on me even in the city. Every shadow, every creak of the floor, every sound at night reminded me of that cabin. It made me hyper-aware, cautious, and, strangely, a little smarter about trusting empty spaces. I learned that fear isn't always about monsters or ghosts. Sometimes it's about people, other humans who watch, wait, and intrude. And when you are alone, there is nothing more frightening than knowing someone could be there, just out of sight, planning, learning, and waiting. Looking back, I realize what I should have done differently. I should have left at the first sign of trouble, reported the tracks immediately, and never gone so deep into isolation without a plan. But I survived, and that survival is something I hold on to. I know now how careful one must be when alone in the woods. I know now that nature is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and human malice is real and close, even when you cannot see it. And most of all, I know that fear is strongest when it is silent, slow, and patient, watching you from the shadows, waiting for you to make a mistake. In the end, I returned to normal life, but the lessons stayed. I am more aware of my surroundings, more cautious when alone, and I never underestimate the power of being observed. That cabin in the woods taught me something no amount of city experience ever could. That fear doesn't need magic or monsters to be real, and sometimes it comes in the quiet footsteps of someone who knows you are alone and watches anyway. I had been looking forward to the weekend for months. The idea of leaving the city behind, even for just a couple of days, filled me with a sense of relief that I hadn't felt in years. Work had become a constant drain, and the unending noise of the streets and the ceaseless flow of people made me crave solitude more than anything. I had rented a cabin in a remote area, far enough from any towns or roads that I would feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. The map I had been given showed nothing but forests surrounding the cabin, and the pictures online promised a quiet retreat. A small wooden structure, a fireplace, a lake a short walk away. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees and the sounds of nature had made me impatient for days. The drive there had been long, much longer than I had expected. The last 20 miles were on a narrow dirt road, riddled with potholes and lined by thick pine trees that seemed to close in the closer I got. My car bounced along uneven surfaces, each bump making me feel further away from safety and more isolated. There was almost no cell service, and the GPS stopped working about 10 miles from the cabin. I had a paper map, but the directions had been vague, simply telling me to follow the main dirt track and take a right at a fork in the road. The forest felt unnervingly quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see any birds, no squirrels, nothing moving except my car. The sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, leaving everything in a dim, greenish light. By the time I saw the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the tall trees, and the shadows stretched long and dark across the ground. The cabin looked just like the pictures, but in person, it had a harsher, lonelier feel. The wood was weathered, rough, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dirty, and the glass rattled faintly in the wind. I pulled up to the cabin and tried the door. It opened easily, as if it hadn't been locked in years. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and dust, a smell that hinted at abandonment. There were signs someone had used it before. Old, unwashed dishes in the sink, a stack of newspapers from months ago, and a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the fireplace. The place wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was cozy enough, and I had brought supplies for cooking, sleeping, and a few small comforts from home. I spent the first few hours unpacking and setting up, placing my bags carefully on the floor and stacking firewood for later. I checked the cabin thoroughly, noting every corner, every door, every window. There was a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with an old shower that I decided to use later. The living area had a table and chairs, a fireplace, and a small couch that looked like it had seen better days. Outside, the clearing gave a clear view of the surrounding forest, and I could see the lake just beyond the tree line. Everything felt peaceful at first, almost too peaceful. I lit the fireplace and sat near it, watching the flames dance, the warmth seeping into my bones after the long drive. As darkness fell completely, I realized just how quiet it was. There were no cars, no planes, no distant voices. Only the wind moving through the trees and the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, a heavy, almost physical quiet that makes every small sound seem magnified. I tried to convince myself it was comforting, that I had wanted this, but an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The first night was restless. I kept hearing noises, small creaks and thumps that I told myself were the cabin settling or animals moving outside. Every time I heard a louder crack, my heart jumped, and I found myself holding my breath. I eventually fell asleep near the fire, the warmth doing its best to mask the growing unease. The next morning, I found more signs. The footprints had returned, circling the cabin, stopping near the windows, as if whoever had been there was watching. I realized that I had no idea how long this person had been there, how often they had returned, or if they were still nearby. Panic was rising, but I forced myself to calm down. I had to think. I started collecting more firewood, moving it closer to the stove, preparing to burn the wood if I needed light or heat. I checked the cabin thoroughly, making sure there were no weak points. I even found an old hunting rifle in a closet, dusty and forgotten. It was loaded, thankfully, but I had never fired a gun before, and I felt a deep unease holding it. Still, it gave me some sense of control. That afternoon, I decided to make a plan in case someone tried to enter. I pushed heavy furniture against the doors, arranged chairs and tables to create obstacles, and kept the rifle close at hand. I took mental notes of the windows, the weak points of the structure, and where I could make a stand if necessary. By evening, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The forest seemed alive in a way that terrified me, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was not just scratching. There was a voice, muffled, coming from outside the cabin. I could not make out the words, but it was low, threatening, almost a whisper. My blood ran cold. I stayed very still, barely breathing. The voice stopped, and there was silence again, except for the creak. I realized that staying put might not be enough. Whoever was out there had been watching me, tracking me, maybe waiting for the right moment. I decided that night that I would leave at first light. I could not stay another night, not knowing if this person was still around, not knowing if they intended to harm me. I packed everything I could into my backpack, leaving nothing behind that could slow me down. The first rays of sunlight barely reached the cabin when I stepped outside, rifle in hand, ready for anything. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I moved. I followed the dirt track back to the main road, watching carefully. I heard twigs snap occasionally behind me, and I knew I was being followed, though I dared not look. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking. The footprints in the mud confirmed my fear. Someone had been tracking me from the cabin to the road. I locked the doors and started the engine, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly as I drove back down the narrow dirt track. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. The relief was immense, but the fear lingered. I realized I had been lucky. Luck and preparation had kept me alive. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local authorities. They told me that the area had a history of people breaking into cabins, sometimes staying hidden for days, watching, waiting for someone to be alone. It was terrifying to think how close I had come to being trapped, with no one around to help. Weeks later, I could still feel the unease every time I closed a door or walked through a quiet street. The forest had been beautiful, yes, but it had also been a trap. I had gone looking for solitude and peace, and instead, I had faced real fear, a fear that was grounded in reality, not imagination. I learned to respect the wilderness, not as a place of adventure or beauty, but as a place where danger could be hidden, silent, and patient. The ending was clear in my mind. I survived because I stayed alert, because I prepared, because I acted. I could have stayed another night, enjoyed the solitude, and paid a much higher price. But I didn't. I left and I told the authorities. The cabin was eventually checked, and no one was found, though the footprints remained. Whoever had been there had disappeared, leaving behind only the memory of the terror and the certainty that some dangers are not imaginary. Even now, months later, I can remember the smell of wet leaves, the sound of the creak of the floorboards, and the darkness of the forest pressing against the cabin walls. It is a memory that never fades, a lesson in fear, survival, and the thin line between solitude and danger. I would not return to that cabin. I would not seek that silence again. I learned that sometimes the world outside is more dangerous than the one inside our heads, and sometimes leaving is the only way to survive. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours when I finally saw the sign for the cabin rental. The road had narrowed long ago into a twisting gravel path, flanked on either side by dense pine forests that blocked almost all sunlight. It was late afternoon, the sky a pale gray, and a cold wind rustled the dead leaves scattered on the ground. The last stretch of the road was rough, full of ruts and loose rocks, and I had to slow my truck to a crawl to avoid scraping the underside. I remember feeling a knot of unease in my stomach, the kind you get when you realize you are very far from any other person, and that if something went wrong, help would not come quickly. But I pushed the feeling down and told myself I had come prepared. I had packed enough food, water, and supplies for a week. I had a first aid kit, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a spare gas can in the truck. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, exactly the kind of place I wanted for some time alone to think and get away from everything. The cabin itself was tucked between a line of tall, gnarled pines. From the road, it looked small and unassuming, built of dark, weathered logs with a metal roof that had rusted in parts. There was a thin trail leading up to the porch, overgrown with weeds, and the whole place had the smell of damp wood and old pine needles. I parked my truck, turned off the engine, and just sat for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was no wind now, only the faint creak of the trees shifting, and the occasional distant caw of a crow. Even though I was alone, I felt eyes on me, though I knew rationally it was just the quiet and my own nerves playing tricks. I started unloading my things, carrying them up the uneven porch. The door was heavy and stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and mildew. It was empty, just a single large room with a small kitchen area on one side and a fireplace on the other. There were 2 bedrooms, one at each end, and a tiny bathroom. Everything was basic and functional, not luxurious, but I had expected that. There were signs that people had been here before. An old rug, a chipped coffee mug, some dust on the shelves. But it was clean enough, and I felt a small sense of relief. At least I had somewhere to settle in. The first night was the hardest. I had planned to get some work done on my laptop, but the internet didn't reach this far into the forest, and the cell phone signal was weak. I lit a fire in the fireplace, and the orange glow cast long shadows across the room. Outside, the forest was completely dark, the trees forming walls that blocked the moonlight. I ate a simple meal, then lay down on the bed, listening to the wind beginning to rise again. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me tense. I tried to remind myself it was just wildlife, that deer and raccoons and birds lived here, but the sounds were sharp and sudden, and the cabin creaked under them as if responding. I slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of branches scraping against the cabin walls. The next morning, I explored the surrounding area. The cabin was situated on the edge of a small clearing, with the forest thickening just beyond it. There was a narrow trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods, though it looked like it hadn't been used much. I noticed old tire tracks from a four-wheel drive truck, but they were mostly covered by leaves and dirt, evidence that few people came this way. I spent the day gathering wood for the fireplace, checking my supplies and making sure I had enough water. The nearby stream looked clear enough to drink from if I needed it, though I had bottles with me. By late afternoon, I felt slightly more comfortable. The isolation was still intense, but it was not unpleasant yet. I told myself this was exactly what I wanted. A week of quiet, with only the sound of the wind and the forest. Then, in the late evening, things started to feel off. I had noticed small things during the day. Footprints near the cabin that didn't match my own, or the sound of movement in the forest that was too deliberate to be a deer. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But as night fell, the sounds became more insistent. There was a scratching at the side of the cabin, soft at first, then louder, like someone or something was dragging a branch against the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly circled the exterior. Nothing. The forest was dark and silent, except for the wind picking up in the trees. I checked the doors and windows, made sure they were locked. My heart was racing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the scratching was heavy, almost like it had weight behind it. Sleep was impossible that night. I kept my flashlight beside the bed, the beam aimed at the door, and I listened. There was a sound outside, soft footsteps moving around the cabin, circling slowly, sometimes stopping, sometimes scraping against the porch. I didn't leave the bedroom, but I could hear it moving. Hours passed like this, and the forest felt suffocating. I felt trapped. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe someone had followed me, maybe it was just a bear or a large animal, but nothing fully explained the deliberate pattern of the sounds. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally fell asleep, exhausted. I spent the next hours inside, keeping doors locked, windows shut. Every rustle outside made me jump. I tried to keep busy, chopping wood for the fireplace, organizing my supplies, cleaning, anything to occupy my mind. But the unease gnawed at me. I could not shake the feeling of being watched. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but then I started noticing things. Small disturbances, subtle but unmistakable. A branch broken near the porch, a rock that had moved, a smudge of dirt on the wooden steps. I had been careful, meticulous, and yet someone had been here while I slept. Someone had walked around, touched things, and they had left no trace besides those subtle signs. The thought alone made my stomach twist. By evening, I decided to stay inside, keep the fire going, and avoid looking out the windows. The scraping sound from last night had returned, softer this time, but closer, as if moving around the cabin's perimeter. I had a knife, and my phone had a signal for emergency calls, but something about this felt different from city crime. This was the forest, vast, empty, and I was alone. Panic began to creep in. I ate nothing that night, too anxious, and sat by the fire with the knife in my lap, listening. The wind outside carried every sound, every faint noise amplified into something threatening. Branches snapped in the distance, and I flinched with every one. The next day, I attempted to leave. I had decided that the risk was too great, that whoever had been around was not going to make their presence known in ways I could ignore. I packed quickly, keeping to the plan of leaving the cabin entirely. I stepped outside, only to see the same footprints circling near my car. My heart dropped. Someone had been there after I had explored in the morning. Whoever it was, they had waited. I didn't even think. They were human, and I was alone. I got into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. But then I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure, standing between the trees near the edge of the clearing, tall, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't see details, only the outline, but it was deliberate. The figure didn't move until I reversed slowly, trying not to draw attention. As soon as I started driving toward the dirt road, it melted into the trees, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. But the tracks, the moved branches, the subtle signs, they told me otherwise. Someone had been here, observing, and I had no idea why. I didn't stop driving until the forest ended, until the asphalt began, and until I was surrounded by cars and people again. The relief was overwhelming, almost unbelievable. I reported what I had seen to the local authorities, providing descriptions, the location, and the timing. They promised to check the area, but I knew better. The forest was vast. Whoever had been there could disappear in minutes. They might be gone forever, or they might return. I didn't go back to that cabin. I didn't even consider it. The memory of standing in the clearing, watching that figure in the trees, was burned into my mind. The way it had waited, the patience, the stillness, it was human, but something in it was wrong. It wasn't just a hiker or a passerby. It was deliberate, observant, calculated. Weeks later, I read a small article online about a series of cabin break-ins in the same forested region, all similar in method. Subtle observation, quiet intrusion, and disappearing without a trace. Nothing had been stolen in most cases. The intruders seemed to only want to know someone was there, to make their presence felt. I shivered. I realized then that I had been lucky. The intruder had never tried to contact me, had never come into the cabin while I was awake. They had circled, watched, waited, and left, leaving nothing but traces for me to notice. And maybe, if I had reacted differently, things could have ended very badly. I never returned to the cabin. I sold the equipment I had bought, sold the camping gear, and I never spoke of the trip except in vague terms. I think about it sometimes, late at night, and I remember the smell of the forest, the cold brush of wind across my skin, and the small, deliberate steps of someone watching me from the shadows. I learned something crucial that trip, something that I carry with me. The wilderness is beautiful, isolating, and sometimes quietly dangerous. Not because of animals or myths, but because of people. People can be patient, people can be observant, and people can be terrifying in ways the mind struggles to comprehend. I survived because of caution, because of a little bit of luck, and because I trusted my instincts when every rational thought told me otherwise. And even though I am safe now, that forest, that cabin, and that figure remain in my memory as a stark, unshakable reminder that isolation can be dangerous not because of what we expect, but because of what we never see coming. I didn't plan to be scared. When I decided to take a weekend off and rent a cabin in the woods, it was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a way to escape the constant noise and pressure of city life. I thought I would spend my time hiking, reading, and just being alone in nature for a few days. I didn't expect fear, and I certainly didn't expect how fragile my sense of safety could be when the world was stripped down to nothing but trees, darkness, and silence. The cabin was a small, weathered wooden structure, not far from a winding dirt road. I had found it online, listed as a cozy rustic getaway, and the pictures had made it look welcoming. A stone path led up to the front door, and a small porch with a rickety railing framed the entrance. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dust, and faint pine from the surrounding forest. The furnishings were basic: a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table with 2 chairs, a sofa that sagged in the middle, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. Upstairs was a single bedroom with a thin mattress and a blanket that had seen better days. The electricity was limited, with a few outlets and a dim ceiling light in the main room. A single window faced the forest, and through it, I could see the towering pines swaying in the wind. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my things, made some food, and took a short walk around the property. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and alive. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the trees were holding their breath. I noticed tracks in the dirt, small deer prints, a few larger ones I couldn't identify. I shrugged it off and told myself it was normal wildlife activity. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, the forest grew darker, and I returned to the cabin. I built a small fire in the wood stove and watched the flames crackle. I felt content, alone but safe. The kind of safe you only feel when there is nothing and no one around, and yet, paradoxically, it was the same quiet that made the back of my neck tingle. The second day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest. There was a trail I had seen on a map, marked as moderate difficulty. I followed it for hours, climbing small ridges and navigating around fallen trees. The forest felt denser the further I went, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in strange patterns that made shadows stretch and twist. Occasionally, I would stop to listen. No birds, no rustling animals, just the sound of my own breathing, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the wind whispering through the branches. I thought it was normal. That's how forests are, quiet if you listen closely. I returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I thought I heard a faint knock at the door. I froze. The cabin was isolated, miles from any other house. Maybe it was a branch hitting the porch. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but my stomach clenched. I checked the windows. Nothing. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat by the stove. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind, the tapping of a branch outside, set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was just the cabin settling. But when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke early. I went outside and noticed that the door latch had marks on it. Scratches, shallow but deliberate, as if someone or something had tried to force it open. My stomach dropped. I had been alone. There was no one around. The only footprints were mine and a few from the forest animals. I checked the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing. I rationalized that maybe a raccoon or a stray dog had tried to get in. But the scratches were too high, too straight to be made by a small animal. My unease grew. I spent most of the day inside, trying to occupy myself with reading and organizing my supplies. I avoided the window facing the forest. I didn't want to see movement that might not be real, didn't want to feed the anxiety crawling up my spine. Yet, no matter what I did, I kept hearing subtle noises. A soft thump on the roof, the creak of a floorboard, the faint rustle of something outside. My mind began to race. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was an hour away, and I had come for solitude. I decided to stay, rationalizing that fear was making me imagine things. I spent the night on edge. Every small sound, the rustle of branches, the snap of a twig, the distant splash of water, made me tense. I checked the locks on the cabin door repeatedly, though I had locked it securely the moment I arrived. I kept a knife near my side, not because I thought it would do much, but because the physical act of holding it made me feel safer. The night seemed endless. I dozed intermittently but was constantly aware of sounds outside, even when I was sure they were my imagination. The next day, I tried to rationalize my fear. I inspected the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of human activity. There were none, at least nothing obvious. No footprints, no discarded items, no evidence of recent visitors. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. I decided to stay closer to the cabin and focus on organizing supplies and gathering firewood. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt tense, almost suffocating. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. That afternoon, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. I stayed perfectly still, listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to circle the cabin, moving slowly, deliberately. My mind raced with possibilities: lost hikers, someone following an old trail, or worse. I realized I had to act to protect myself. I checked my phone. No signal. I thought about walking out to the main road, but it was miles away, and the forest was dense. I felt trapped. I decided to secure the cabin more thoroughly. I moved heavy furniture against the door, reinforced the windows with boards I found in the shed, and made sure all possible entry points were blocked. I gathered firewood close to the cabin so I wouldn't have to go far after dark. I tried to keep busy, organizing supplies, checking food, making sure I had clean water, but every little noise made my heart jump. I realized I was in a survival situation, and the forest was no longer just a peaceful retreat. That night was worse than the first. The footsteps returned, circling the cabin, sometimes stopping for long stretches before starting again. I could hear branches snapping, leaves rustling, and at one point, the unmistakable sound of someone breathing. I stayed hidden behind a barricade of furniture, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the windows. Hours passed like this, my body tense, muscles aching from holding a defensive position. Sleep was impossible. By morning, the footsteps had stopped. I cautiously opened the door to inspect the surroundings. The forest was empty, silent except for the usual sounds of birds and small animals. I searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to indicate a person had been near the cabin at all. The sense of unease remained, but I realized I had survived the night. I spent the following days carefully planning a way out. I needed to reach the main road, where I could get help or at least be seen by someone. I packed my backpack, leaving minimal supplies in the cabin, and made a mental map of the route I would take. I traveled during the day, moving quietly but quickly, avoiding unnecessary risks. The forest was unforgiving. Uneven terrain, dense underbrush, and occasional encounters with wildlife. But I pushed forward, determined to leave. On the third day, I reached a dirt road that led to a small town. I flagged down a passing vehicle and explained my situation. The driver, concerned, called the local authorities, who accompanied me back to the cabin. When we returned, there was no sign of anyone. The authorities could not explain what had happened. They assured me the area was safe, but I knew I would never feel that way again. In the end, I realized how unprepared I had been for the true isolation of the forest. The experience taught me about vigilance, awareness, and the fragile nature of safety when alone in the wilderness. I had survived through careful observation, preparation, and a constant awareness of my surroundings. When I finally left the area, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease, knowing that the forest held dangers far beyond what I had imagined. Back home, I slowly returned to normal life, but the memory of those nights remained vivid. The oppressive silence, the feeling of being watched, the deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I never returned to that forest, and I never again took solitude for granted. The experience left me wary, cautious, but also more attuned to the world around me. I learned that nature, while beautiful and peaceful, could be indifferent and unforgiving. And I learned that sometimes the scariest experiences are the ones that leave no trace, the ones where you question reality itself and survive only because of vigilance, quick thinking, and sheer endurance. I drove for hours on a narrow, winding forest road that seemed to get narrower with every mile. The sun was beginning to dip behind the distant hills, turning the sky a dull orange, streaked with gray clouds. My old sedan bounced along potholes that had been poorly patched, and the headlights barely lit more than 10 feet in front of the car. I had been warned about this road, that it wasn't maintained well and that cell service was unreliable, but I had insisted on coming alone. I needed isolation, a break from everything. The small cabin I rented was supposed to be my sanctuary for the next week, a place far from anyone, tucked into the middle of the forest where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and maybe the occasional bird. That image had seemed romantic in the pictures online, but reality was different. Reality was the smell of damp earth pressing against the tires, the tension of driving through dense trees with no one around for miles, and the uneasy feeling that I was being watched even though there was no one there. When I finally found the driveway, I had to stop the car and get out to check the map. The driveway was overgrown, lined with branches that scraped against the sides of my car. I squeezed through, careful not to scratch the paint. The forest around me was quiet in a way that made me tense. There was no rustling of small animals, no birds, nothing but the whisper of the wind through the pine trees. I reached the cabin after about a mile of driving on this barely there path. From the outside, it looked sturdy. Dark wood panels, a simple porch, a slanted roof with a small chimney. Smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, which I expected, but I didn't think too much about it. I was here alone. It wasn't like anyone would be visiting. The first thing I noticed as I stepped inside was the smell. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was heavy with the scent of old wood, dampness, and something earthy I couldn't place. The cabin was small but functional. A single room served as the living area and kitchen, with a wood stove against one wall and a small bed tucked into a corner. There was a bathroom, and I saw that the water was running fine. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, placing my bag on the floor and opening the windows to let in fresh air. The sun was setting, and the forest outside began to darken, shadows stretching across the walls in strange, shifting patterns. I decided to start a fire in the wood stove, though it had been stocked with wood and kindling. I wanted warmth, yes, but mostly I wanted the feeling of control that came with fire. Using a match to light the kindling, I watched the flames catch, the wood hissing and crackling as smoke curled up the chimney. The light from the fire gave the room a soft orange glow, pushing back the dark corners. I felt better. For a moment, I told myself I was being silly to feel nervous. This was just a cabin. Nothing more. Night fell fast. The air grew colder, pressing against the cabin walls, and I wrapped myself in a blanket on the small couch, staring into the fire. I had brought a notebook, intending to write, but my mind wandered. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the forest settling, animals moving through undergrowth. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the back of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening. The sound was faint but deliberate, and it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was a branch brushing against the cabin, a tree reacting to the wind, but the sound had been too controlled, too precise to be random. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously walked toward the back door. Outside, the night was thick and black, the trees standing like silent guards. Nothing moved. I scanned the perimeter, shining the light into the shadows, but saw nothing. No branches, no animals, no human shapes. Just darkness. I went back inside, trying to calm down. I checked the locks on the doors, even though they seemed sturdy. I made sure the windows were closed and latched. I sat back down near the fire, trying to focus on the warmth, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Eventually, I fell asleep, curled up on the couch, the fire dwindling to glowing embers.